Mythical Origins and the Mandate of Heaven. In the dawn of Chinese civilization, long before historical records began, myth and reality intertwined in a seamless flow of oral tradition, spiritual reverence, and symbolic narrative. The mythical origins of China are not merely fantastical stories told by firelight. They are foundational epics that shaped an entire worldview, a way of understanding power, morality, and the cosmos. These stories, often centered around divine rulers and cosmic order, gave birth to one of the most enduring political and spiritual doctrines in East Asia, the Mandate of Heaven. This belief system was not simply a tool of governance, it was a reflection of a deep cultural need to find harmony between human rule and the will of the universe. In the mythic memory of ancient China, civilization did not emerge from chaos by chance, but through the acts of enlightened beings and semi-divine heroes. Among the most revered figures are the three sovereigns and five emperors, cultural archetypes rather than political kings. These legendary rulers, such as Fuxi, Nua, Shennong, and the Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, are said to have brought essential knowledge to humanity: agriculture, writing, medicine, and governance. Their contributions were not random inventions, but were seen as revelations gifted to humankind through cosmic alignment and divine favor. This concept laid the groundwork for a world where rule was not seized by force alone, but bestowed through legitimacy that transcended the human realm. The idea that a ruler's right to govern came from a higher unseen power took shape gradually but with profound impact. At the heart of it was the conviction that heaven, Tian, an impersonal but moral cosmic force, governed the universe. This force was not a deity in the way Western traditions often understood gods. It was a guiding principle, one that maintained order, rewarded virtue, and punished transgression. When rulers aligned with heaven's will, their reigns were prosperous and just. When they deviated, calamities followed: famines, floods, rebellion. Thus, kingship was conditional, and this conditionality offered both a moral compass and a justification for revolution. The first dynasty to formalize this principle was the Zhou, whose rise around 1046 BCE marked a turning point in Chinese political philosophy. After overthrowing the Shang dynasty, the Zhou rulers claimed legitimacy not merely through conquest, but by asserting that the Shang had lost the mandate of heaven due to their moral decay and tyrannical behavior. This narrative transformed what could have been seen as a simple regime change into a cosmic rebalancing. The Zhou's interpretation of the fall of Shang introduced a powerful precedent. Rulers who failed in virtue would be stripped of divine favor and replaced. It was a doctrine that lent righteousness to rebellion, provided it was in service of restoring moral order. Unlike the divine right of kings in some Western traditions, the mandate of heaven was not permanent or inherited unconditionally. It was fluid, revocable, and dependent upon conduct. A ruler could lose the mandate by becoming corrupt, cruel, or neglectful of his duties to the people. This dynamic made the relationship between ruler and ruled a sacred covenant, with the ruler as the intermediary between heaven and earth. Natural disasters, uprisings, or economic failure were not just misfortunes. They were seen as omens, signs that heaven had turned its back on the current leadership. It was both a warning and a call to restore virtue and justice. This belief system had a profound stabilizing effect on Chinese history, paradoxically allowing for both the continuity of dynastic rule and the justification of its collapse. The cyclical rise and fall of dynasties, known as the dynastic cycle, became a deeply internalized historical pattern. Each new dynasty claimed the mandate. Each old one was remembered for the moment it lost it. It created a narrative structure for history itself, one that emphasized moral renewal and cosmic balance. The mandate of heaven thus became more than political propaganda. It was a collective memory device and a moral framework for understanding change. Importantly, this concept also empowered the people, at least in a symbolic sense. While commoners could not declare a change of mandate, their suffering could be interpreted as heaven's voice. Popular unrest, then, was not merely a social threat, it was a spiritual signal. This imbued the masses with a quiet authority, one that leaders ignored at their peril. While the system certainly favored elites and entrenched power structures, it also placed a sacred duty on rulers to govern wisely, fairly, and with the welfare of their subjects in mind. The mythology surrounding ancient rulers reinforced these ideas. Take, for instance, the tale of Emperor Yao, one of the five emperors, who was said to have been so wise and just that he willingly passed the throne to a humble commoner, Shun, known for his filial piety and virtue. This story, whether fact or fable, illustrates the underlying ideal. Merit and virtue, not bloodline alone, grant access to rightful rule. It was a narrative of morality over inheritance, setting a model of what leadership should aspire to, even if rarely practiced in full. Later dynasties continued to invoke the mandate of heaven to affirm their legitimacy. The Han, Tang, Song, Ming, and Qing all framed their rise as restorations of divine order after periods of chaos or immorality. Even rebel leaders, such as those of the Red Turban movement that helped bring down the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty, cloaked their actions in the language of cosmic justice. They were not mere insurgents. They were instruments of heaven's correction. The mandate of heaven also extended beyond borders, shaping foreign perceptions of Chinese authority. Neighboring states, particularly those influenced by Confucian thought, adopted similar models or acknowledged China's central moral authority through ritual tribute. This reinforced a Sinocentric worldview in which China was not just a geographic entity, but the moral heart of civilization, entrusted by heaven to lead. However, the abstraction of the mandate also made it vulnerable to manipulation. Ambitious warlords and power-hungry figures could claim divine sanction to justify their conquests. At times, the invocation of the mandate became formulaic, used less as a reflection of real virtue and more as a convenient rhetorical tool. Still, the people remained sensitive to the signs: floods, famine, foreign invasion, and these continued to serve as moral verdicts on leadership. The system worked not because it guaranteed moral leadership, but because it demanded a constant rejustification of authority. During the late imperial period, particularly under the Ming and Qing, the mandate of heaven remained potent, but began to strain under the weight of its own expectations. As internal corruption mounted and external pressures grew, particularly from Western powers, rulers struggled to maintain the image of heaven's favor. The Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, and foreign humiliation cast doubt on whether heaven still smiled upon the Middle Kingdom. By the time the Qing dynasty fell in the early 20th century, the mandate had become a hollow echo, still referenced but no longer trusted as the ultimate judge of legitimacy. Yet even in modern times, the echoes of this ancient concept remain. The idea that leaders must be morally accountable, that power must serve the people, and that unjust rule cannot last forever continues to resonate in Chinese thought. In a culture where history is a living presence, not a distant memory, the mandate of heaven is not just a relic. It is a principle that endures in spirit, shaping how power is perceived, judged, and remembered. The story of mythical origins and the mandate of heaven is, ultimately, the story of how a civilization framed its identity, not only in relation to its ancestors, but to the stars above and the ground beneath. It represents a worldview where humanity is never truly separate from the cosmic order, where rulers are not above the people, but stewards of something greater. It offers a vision of leadership tempered by humility, vigilance, and a sense of duty to the unseen forces that govern all things. Through this lens, history becomes more than a record of names and dates. It becomes a dialogue between heaven and earth, and between rulers and the ruled, always unfolding, always demanding renewal. Oracle bones and the birth of Chinese writing. In the vast expanse of ancient Chinese history, where myth and reality often wove together, one of the most astonishing discoveries ever made was not a monument, a weapon, or a relic of gold, but fragments of bone and shell inscribed with strange characters. These were the oracle bones, the earliest known evidence of Chinese writing, and they opened a portal into a world where kings conversed with spirits, where divination shaped decisions of state, and where written language began its journey through time. They were not found in pristine temples or royal tombs, but often in fields, mistaken for dragon bones and ground into medicine. Yet once deciphered, they revealed the deep roots of a civilization whose voice had endured across millennia. The use of oracle bones is believed to have begun during the late Shang dynasty, around 1200 BCE, in the ancient city of Yinshu, near present-day Anyang. These bones, typically ox scapulae or turtle plastrons, were used by Shang kings and their diviners to seek guidance from ancestors and deities. The process of divination was meticulous and ceremonial. First, the bones were cleaned and prepared. Then, shallow pits were carved on their undersides, and intense heat was applied using metal rods, causing the bones to crack. These cracks were interpreted as answers from the spiritual realm. The diviner would then inscribe the questions and the results on the surface. Questions ranged from predictions about weather and harvests to warfare, childbirth, and even dreams. The inscriptions were precise and formulaic, revealing a society deeply concerned with order, fate, and cosmic harmony. The language inscribed on these bones was an early form of Chinese script, what would eventually evolve into the complex system of characters still in use today. These were not primitive symbols, but already showed structure and stylistic conventions. Over 100,000 fragments have been unearthed, each bearing anywhere from a handful to several dozen characters. These early inscriptions represent the earliest known stage of the Chinese writing system, providing not only linguistic data but a rare glimpse into the concerns, beliefs, and administrative workings of the Shang rulers. The bones speak volumes not only for their script but also for their content. They reflect a society ruled by kings who positioned themselves as intermediaries between the human world and the divine. The king was not merely a political figure, but also a religious authority, consulting the spirits on everything from military campaigns to sacrificial rituals. The questions he asked show the weight of his responsibilities and the anxieties of leadership. If a war was to be launched, the king would ask whether victory was assured, what day was most auspicious, and whether the ancestors approved. If a child was expected, the king might inquire whether it would be a boy or girl, and whether it would bring fortune or misfortune. These inquiries document a profound belief that the world was interconnected by spiritual forces that could be read, understood, and influenced through proper ritual. While the bones were buried in royal archives or pit dumps after use, they were eventually forgotten as dynasties rose and fell. For centuries, their significance was lost. During the late Qing dynasty in the 19th century, farmers and apothecaries stumbled upon them in fields, believing them to be ancient medicinal materials. Known as dragon bones, they were crushed and used in remedies for various ailments. It was only when scholars examined these bones and noticed the faint carvings that their true historical value was rediscovered. In 1899, Wang Yirong, a scholar and antiquarian, recognized the markings as early writing and sparked a wave of academic interest that would change the study of Chinese history forever. The rediscovery of oracle bones marked one of the most important archaeological breakthroughs in Chinese history. Not only did it confirm the existence of the Shang dynasty, previously debated and lacking solid evidence, but it also established the incredible continuity of Chinese script and culture. The bones became a key to understanding the origins of Chinese civilization, offering insight into its earliest governmental, religious, and societal structures. Through the inscriptions, historians could piece together royal genealogies, administrative systems, rituals, and events previously preserved only through oral tradition or myth. The oracle bone script itself is both beautiful and complex. It predates the standardized seal script of later dynasties and is considered the direct ancestor of modern Chinese writing. Though many characters are recognizable in their modern forms, others have changed significantly, their meanings and shapes shifting with the currents of time. Some of the oracle bone characters were pictographic, representing objects or animals, while others were more abstract, representing ideas, numbers, or grammatical functions. This script reveals the remarkable ingenuity of the early scribes who forged a language capable of capturing not just speech, but thought, law, and ritual. The act of writing on bones also had ritual significance. It was not just about recording an answer, but affirming the question's importance to the universe. The bones became vessels for divine communication, their cracks interpreted with the same gravity that later societies would reserve for sacred texts or holy visions. This was writing born from a need to make sense of the world, to bind action to fate, and to preserve memory across time. It was a writing system forged not in commerce or poetry, but in fire and bone, through the anxious breath of kings and the reverent touch of diviners. As the Zhou dynasty eventually replaced the Shang, the oracle bone tradition waned, replaced by different forms of divination and script. Yet its influence endured. The concept of writing as sacred, as a connection to the cosmic order, persisted throughout Chinese history. Later scripts would be brushed on silk and carved into stone, but they all traced their lineage back to those earliest inscriptions. The reverence for calligraphy, the use of writing in bureaucracy, ritual, and education, all these have roots in the legacy of the oracle bones. Even today, the fascination with ancient Chinese characters and the pursuit of calligraphic mastery reflect this enduring cultural inheritance. In modern times, the study of oracle bones remains a vital field within archaeology and sinology. Each fragment, however small, has the potential to reveal new insights about Shang-era politics, language, belief systems, and daily life. Teams of scholars carefully catalog the characters, compare their forms, and try to reconstruct the full context in which they were written. The work is painstaking, but the rewards are immense. Oracle bones are not just historical records, they are windows into the first self-aware steps of a civilization that would go on to shape the world in profound ways. Their discovery also challenges our assumptions about how writing begins. In many cultures, writing emerged from commercial or legal necessity, the need to account for goods or record transactions. In China, it appears to have emerged as a tool of divination and royal communication, with its origins deeply embedded in religious and ritual life. This distinction sets Chinese writing apart and highlights the unique path of cultural development in East Asia. It also reinforces the notion that writing, while utilitarian, is also profoundly spiritual, capable of linking generations through shared symbols and remembered truths. The oracle bones remind us that history is not always written in ink or carved into marble. Sometimes it is burned into bone by fire, hidden in the earth for centuries, and only later recognized for what it truly is, a message from the distant past, waiting to be heard. In each line, etched onto the scapula of an ox or the shell of a turtle, lies the voice of a king asking the universe for guidance, the hand of a scribe preserving a nation's questions, and the first flickers of a script that would survive conquest, revolution, and time itself. These bones do not merely speak of the past, they carry the weight of beginnings, the birth of writing, the dawn of history, and the echoes of a civilization finding its voice for the very first time. Silk Road and the global reach of Han China. The Silk Road and the global reach of Han China mark one of the most pivotal developments in the tapestry of ancient history. It was not a single path, but rather an expansive web of trade routes that stitched together faraway civilizations across Asia, the Middle East, and even into parts of Europe and Africa. The rise of the Han dynasty in China, particularly during the reign of Emperor Wu, gave birth to the vision of an interconnected world where silk, spices, ideas, and diplomatic envoys moved across vast deserts, treacherous mountain passes, and powerful kingdoms. The Silk Road was as much a road for culture and diplomacy as it was for commerce, with the Han Empire positioned at its eastern gate, projecting power, innovation, and influence beyond its frontiers. As Han China consolidated its internal structure, strengthened its military, and expanded westward, it encountered powerful steppe tribes and rival civilizations. The need to secure alliances and trade partners became pressing, particularly to counter the threat of the Xiongnu Confederation. This led to the famed mission of Zhang Xian, a Han envoy dispatched across dangerous and unknown lands to seek allies in Central Asia. Though he was captured and detained for years, Zhang Xian eventually returned with valuable information about distant peoples, their economies, and potential routes for trade. His journey, though perilous, opened the door for China's interaction with the wider world, making him a foundational figure in the story of the Silk Road. With Zhang Xian's reports in hand, the Han court realized the potential of establishing links with the West. Chinese silk, already highly prized for its fine quality, became the primary commodity that began to flow outward. At the same time, goods from India, Persia, and even the Mediterranean regions started trickling in. Horses, glassware, precious stones, and new crops were among the many items that moved across these routes. The demand for Chinese silk in Roman markets became so intense that it even concerned Roman officials who viewed the outflow of gold as a threat to their economy. Yet this trade thrived, facilitated by intermediaries who passed goods from one region to another, often never seeing the final destination themselves. The impact of this trade extended far beyond material wealth. Ideas began to move across borders. Religions, philosophies, and artistic styles journeyed along with the caravans. Buddhism, for example, began to take root in China through this eastward movement from India. This ideological migration profoundly shaped Chinese thought, art, and spiritual life. In turn, Chinese methods of governance, Confucian ideals, and innovations in technology subtly influenced neighboring regions. The Silk Road became an invisible thread of shared human experience, where different cultures learned to coexist, exchange, and evolve through indirect contact. The Han government actively supported these trade endeavors. To protect caravans and ensure the routes remained open, they established military garrisons and administrative outposts in the western regions. These frontier settlements served as both protection and proof of Chinese authority, making the empire's presence felt far beyond the traditional borders of the Yellow River Basin. The garrisons also helped control and tax trade, turning commerce into a source of revenue and soft power. By securing these corridors, the Han state not only reaped economic benefits, but also asserted its prestige on the global stage. In addition to trade and diplomacy, the Silk Road became a strategic instrument for intelligence gathering and foreign policy. Envoys traveled bearing gifts, observing political structures, reporting on military strength, and engaging in subtle negotiations. These missions were not only symbols of goodwill, but also tools of statecraft. The Han emperors understood that soft influence could be more enduring than direct conquest. In this way, Han China managed to maintain relations with distant societies, such as the Parthians, Kushans, and other Central Asian entities, while keeping internal resources focused on sustaining imperial control at home. Culturally, the Silk Road spurred a flowering of the arts within Han China. New motifs appeared on pottery, textiles, and murals. Artisans experimented with foreign materials and techniques. Musical instruments and dance forms were introduced from Central Asia, enriching court entertainment and public performance. The culinary world expanded as well, with ingredients from Western regions adding flavor and variety to Chinese dishes. The presence of foreign merchants and travelers in cities like Chang'an introduced visual diversity, language shifts, and occasional tensions, but more often than not, it sparked curiosity and mutual appreciation. The reach of Han China through the Silk Road was not merely limited to physical goods or occasional envoys. There was a growing recognition that China was part of something bigger, a broader global matrix of trade and communication. Maps were updated, astronomical knowledge was shared, and medical practices were influenced by Indian and Persian traditions. This exposure to new perspectives encouraged intellectual debate and scientific inquiry. Chinese scholars began to document foreign flora, fauna, and customs, building early forms of comparative ethnography. In doing so, the Han Empire did not simply trade, it listened, observed, and learned. While the overland Silk Road was central, maritime trade also began to flourish under Han rule. Ports along the southern coast of China linked to routes that passed through Southeast Asia and into the Indian Ocean. These sea routes allowed for the transport of bulkier goods and opened up even wider networks of exchange. The blend of land and sea trade routes underscored the expansive reach of Han China and its strategic capacity to adapt to different logistical needs. These routes also played a role in spreading Chinese influence into regions such as Vietnam and the Malay Peninsula, further expanding its soft power footprint. Despite the glories of Silk Road commerce and diplomacy, the undertaking was not without challenges. Banditry, political instability in intermediary regions, and logistical difficulties were constant threats. Empires along the route could collapse or turn hostile, disrupting the flow of goods and information. Natural obstacles like sandstorms, blizzards, and droughts could delay caravans for weeks. Yet, these hardships did not break the spirit of the network. Instead, they fostered resilience and innovation. Caravans adapted, new routes emerged, and alliances shifted, but the road endured, testament to the human desire for connection and cooperation. In time, the Silk Road would outlive the Han Dynasty, its arteries pulsing with the energy of countless civilizations that followed. But the foundation laid by Han China, through its vision, policies, and people, remained crucial. The Han model of engaging with the world without surrendering cultural identity proved enduring. The empire's ability to both influence and absorb without being overwhelmed helped shape the nature of China's relationship with the world for centuries to come. The legacy of the Han dynasty's global reach through the Silk Road is still visible today. Artifacts unearthed across vast regions carry traces of Han craftsmanship. Chinese silks have been found in burial mounds thousands of miles from their origin. Ancient texts record the awe with which foreign visitors regarded the power and sophistication of Han China. These remnants are silent witnesses to a time when borders were bridges and the world seemed both large and small, large in its geographic expanse, but small in its shared desire for exchange. Through its determined reach across mountains, deserts, and foreign lands, Han China showed that empires could build influence not only through conquest, but through dialogue, trade, and cultural curiosity. The Silk Road was not merely a commercial artery, it was a manifestation of human ambition, ingenuity, and imagination. And at its heart stood the Han dynasty, a power that dared to look beyond its horizons and succeeded in leaving a mark on the very fabric of global history. The Silk Road's enduring resonance in global history is not merely the result of trade or distant diplomatic missions. It is rooted in the transformative effect it had on human connectivity. As Han China extended its presence westward, it did more than move goods. It sparked a new era of interaction where ideas, faith, sciences, and even diseases journeyed with the caravans. While the physical roads were trodden by countless feet and hooves, the true journey was internal, reshaping how individuals and empires perceived each other across vast distances. The cultural transformations driven by these interactions would ripple across centuries. A defining feature of Han China's strategy was the calculated use of cultural exchange to reinforce its political stability. Confident in its traditions, the Han court promoted Chinese writing systems, legal codes, and philosophical tenets to peripheral regions through scholars and emissaries. These were not forced impositions, but often welcomed by frontier leaders who saw in Chinese governance models a path to legitimacy and structure. As scripts and record-keeping practices moved westward, a parallel process occurred. Foreign legends, poetry, and storytelling traditions moved east. This blending of narratives added new depth to Chinese literature and broadened its worldview. Craftsmanship also became a trans-regional dialogue. Chinese artisans learned new techniques in metallurgy, particularly from Central Asian and Iranian smiths. Gold inlays, cloisonné, and decorative patterns previously unseen in East Asia began to appear in Han jewelry and ceremonial items. Conversely, Chinese lacquerware, paper production methods, and porcelain concepts found their way westward, adapted by craftsmen unfamiliar with the raw materials but inspired by the aesthetic elegance. These exchanges did not erase local styles, but layered them, creating hybrids that mirrored the interconnectedness of their makers. Scientific knowledge was among the most valuable, though intangible, cargo traded across the Silk Road. Chinese medical theories encountered Indian Ayurvedic principles and Persian medicinal practices. Herbal knowledge was compared and cataloged, treatments shared, and anatomical insights debated by physicians who never met face-to-face, but learned through translated manuscripts or oral relays passed by travelers. Astronomers, too, benefited. Han skywatchers who relied on intricate celestial calendars began integrating foreign observations into their models. This quiet revolution of knowledge enriched Han society, reinforcing the idea that wisdom did not belong to one civilization alone. Another aspect of the Silk Road's influence was the shaping of identity and fashion in the Han Empire. As new textiles and dyes became available, clothing styles began to reflect external influences. Robes with Central Asian patterns, belts with steppe-style buckles, and footwear modeled after nomadic designs began to appear in urban centers. These were not limited to merchants or the elite. Common citizens, too, adopted elements of foreign dress. The visual blending of styles subtly changed how people saw themselves and each other, encouraging a more cosmopolitan outlook that softened the lines between Chinese and foreign. Entertainment evolved as well. Traveling performers, musicians, and dancers often crossed the boundaries between empires, moving from one court to another. The Han capital welcomed entertainers from Bactria, India, and Parthia, who brought with them instruments unfamiliar to Chinese audiences: harps, lutes, and flutes tuned to different scales. Their performances introduced new rhythms and theatrical forms, which were then adapted into local traditions. These influences left lasting marks on courtly music, temple rituals, and popular festivals, subtly weaving foreign threads into the cultural fabric of Han China. One of the less visible yet deeply significant impacts of the Silk Road was the reshaping of religious life. While Buddhism's arrival is well known, less attention is given to how the idea of religious plurality began to gain traction in Han society. Previously, state rituals centered around ancestor worship and Confucian rites, but the encounter with new religious philosophies encouraged more introspection about existence, suffering, and the afterlife. Temples dedicated to foreign deities began to appear along trade hubs, frequented not only by foreign traders but also by local converts seeking spiritual answers outside traditional doctrine. This subtle shift in religious thinking created space for later spiritual developments in China. The frontier cities that flourished because of Silk Road traffic became unique melting pots of culture. Places like Dunhuang and Khotan evolved into multicultural centers where Chinese, Sogdian, Indian, and Persian influences collided daily. These urban spaces became hubs of innovation, where traders, monks, translators, and diplomats lived side by side, negotiated in multiple languages, and dined on dishes that blended ingredients from distant lands. Bilingual inscriptions and mixed burial customs found in these cities reveal how identities merged and adapted, giving rise to a cultural flexibility that was rare for the time. Security, a constant concern on the Silk Road, prompted Han China to rethink how it protected both its territory and its influence. The traditional model of centralized garrisons was supplemented by cooperative arrangements with local tribes and allied city-states. These outposts often served dual roles, as military watchpoints and as cultural outposts where Chinese customs were shared and, in turn, adopted by local leaders. This approach built long-term loyalty and created a buffer zone of friendly states between the Han core and more hostile nomadic regions. These relationships were strengthened through marriages, exchanges of hostages, and mutual economic dependency. Great Walls. Before the Great Wall. Long before the world came to know the iconic stone serpent winding across China's northern frontier, the Great Wall as it stands today, there existed a series of formidable structures and defenses that paved the way for its eventual creation. These early walls, lesser known yet crucial in their own right, were built by various Chinese states and kingdoms during times of turmoil and fragmentation. They served not only as physical barriers against invasions, but also as political statements and administrative markers, signifying the complex relationship between centralized authority and regional defense. The Great Wall, often associated with the Ming Dynasty's massive efforts, was not a sudden invention, but the result of centuries of experimentation, necessity, and evolution. The earliest forms of defensive walls in China emerged during the Spring and Autumn period, which spanned from roughly the 8th to the 5th century BCE. This was a time when the Zhou dynasty's central power weakened, leading to the rise of numerous rival states. These warring polities were often at odds with one another and with non-Chinese nomadic tribes who posed frequent threats from the north and west. In such a volatile environment, constructing walls became a practical solution to protect borders, towns, and valuable resources. These walls were not unified structures, but scattered fortifications reflecting local concerns and ambitions. They were often built of rammed earth, a practical material at the time, capable of forming solid, long-lasting structures when properly compacted. As rivalries deepened in the Warring States period that followed, from the 5th to 3rd century BCE, the construction of walls became even more widespread and systematic. States like Qin, Zhao, Yan, and Wei all built extensive wall networks to defend their domains. The state of Zhao, for instance, constructed a long wall in the north to ward off incursions from nomadic groups, such as the Xiongnu. These early walls were not merely passive barriers. They were integrated into military strategies, often supported by watchtowers, beacon systems, and garrisons. They formed a part of a larger vision of territorial control and defense logistics. The building of walls also demonstrated the growing administrative capacities of these states, which could now mobilize large numbers of laborers and manage the long-term maintenance of these fortifications. What makes these early walls particularly interesting is how they reflect the different strategic mindsets of the Chinese states. Some walls were built to isolate and entrench, creating a clear line between friend and foe. Others were more flexible, designed with passes and gates that allowed trade and diplomatic contact while still providing defense. These designs showed a keen understanding of geography, utilizing mountains, rivers, and natural bottlenecks to strengthen defensive lines. The walls were rarely continuous like the later Great Wall. Rather, they were broken into sections tailored to specific strategic needs. In many cases, they followed the natural topography of the land, merging with hills and ridges to maximize their defensive advantage. Perhaps the most notable precursor to the Great Wall as we know it was the series of walls built by the Qin state under the leadership of Lord Xiangyang and later King Zheng, who became Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor. After the unification of China in 221 BCE, Qin Shi Huang ordered the connection of existing walls built by former rival states. His goal was to secure the northern frontier against nomadic tribes and solidify the boundaries of the newly formed empire. Unlike the independent walls of the past, these were now brought under a central command, forming the first version of a unified long wall that stretched across northern China. It was a feat of coordination and labor on a scale that had not been seen before. The construction mobilized hundreds of thousands of workers, many of whom were soldiers, peasants, and convicts. These walls, though still primarily made of rammed earth, symbolized a new phase in imperial architecture, one that aimed to project centralized strength and permanence. However, the walls built by Qin were only maintained for a relatively short period. With the fall of the Qin dynasty and the rise of the Han, attention shifted toward diplomacy, trade, and military campaigns that pushed China's influence deeper into Central Asia. Still, the idea of a northern wall endured. The Han dynasty made repairs and extensions to the walls, especially in response to renewed threats from the Xiongnu. Their efforts highlighted the shifting balance between militarization and diplomacy, as they tried both to contain and to negotiate with northern tribes. The Han walls included innovations such as more permanent garrison posts and early warning systems using smoke signals and fire beacons, systems that would become standard in later periods. Even during times when the central government did not prioritize wall construction, local governors and frontier commanders continued to build regional defenses. These efforts were often driven by necessity rather than imperial directive. In the centuries following the Han, China went through periods of fragmentation and internal conflict, such as during the Three Kingdoms and later the Northern and Southern dynasties. During these times, the use of walls as military infrastructure became sporadic but no less important. Fortified towns and regional walls were common, particularly in northern China, where conflict with steppe nomads remained a constant concern. Some of these walls used stone in their construction, a shift from earlier reliance on rammed earth, indicating both technological development and a change in available resources or construction preferences. One significant example from this post-Han period comes from the Northern Wei dynasty, a regime founded by the Shanbei, a nomadic people who themselves settled and Sinicized. The Northern Wei constructed long walls in the north, understanding firsthand the importance of defensive lines in managing both external threats and internal stability. These walls not only defended territory, but also helped regulate migration and secure trade routes. The dual identity of the Northern Wei, as both former nomads and new rulers of Chinese lands, gave them a unique perspective on border management, which they applied to their construction efforts. Great Walls. Before the Great Wall. Long before the world came to know the iconic stone serpent winding across China's northern frontier, the Great Wall as it stands today, there existed a series of formidable structures and defenses that paved the way for its eventual creation. These early walls, lesser known yet crucial in their own right, were built by various Chinese states and kingdoms during times of turmoil and fragmentation. They served not only as physical barriers against invasions, but also as political statements and administrative markers. signifying the complex relationship between centralized authority and regional defense. The Great Wall, often associated with the Ming Dynasty's massive efforts, was not a sudden invention, but the result of centuries of experimentation, necessity, and evolution. The earliest forms of defensive walls in China emerged during the Spring and Autumn period, which spanned from roughly the 8th to the 5th century BCE. This was a time when the Zhou dynasty's central power weakened, leading to the rise of numerous rival states. These warring polities were often at odds with one another and with non-Chinese nomadic tribes who posed frequent threats from the north and west. In such a volatile environment, constructing walls became a practical solution to protect borders, towns, and valuable resources. These walls were not unified structures, but scattered fortifications reflecting local concerns and ambitions. They were often built of rammed earth, a practical material at the time, capable of forming solid, long-lasting structures when properly compacted. As rivalries deepened in the Warring States period that followed, from the 5th to 3rd century BCE, the construction of walls became even more widespread and systematic. States like Qin, Zhao, Yan, and Wei all built extensive wall networks to defend their domains. The state of Zhao, for instance, constructed a long wall in the north to ward off incursions from nomadic groups, such as the Xiongnu. These early walls were not merely passive barriers. They were integrated into military strategies, often supported by watchtowers, beacon systems, and garrisons. They formed a part of a larger vision of territorial control and defense logistics. The building of walls also demonstrated the growing administrative capacities of these states, which could now mobilize large numbers of laborers and manage the long-term maintenance of these fortifications. What makes these early walls particularly interesting is how they reflect the different strategic mindsets of the Chinese states. Some walls were built to isolate and entrench, creating a clear line between friend and foe. Others were more flexible, designed with passes and gates that allowed trade and diplomatic contact while still providing defense. These designs showed a keen understanding of geography, utilizing mountains, rivers, and natural bottlenecks to strengthen defensive lines. The walls were rarely continuous like the later Great Wall. Rather, they were broken into sections tailored to specific strategic needs. In many cases, they followed the natural topography of the land, merging with hills and ridges to maximize their defensive advantage. Perhaps the most notable precursor to the Great Wall as we know it was the series of walls built by the Qin state under the leadership of Lord Shangyang and later King Zheng, who became Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor. After the unification of China in 221 BCE, Qin Shi Huang ordered the connection of existing walls built by former rival states. His goal was to secure the northern frontier against nomadic tribes and solidify the boundaries of the newly formed empire. Unlike the independent walls of the past, these were now brought under a central command, forming the first version of a unified long wall that stretched across northern China. It was a feat of coordination and labor on a scale that had not been seen before. The construction mobilized hundreds of thousands of workers, many of whom were soldiers, peasants, and convicts. These walls, though still primarily made of rammed earth, symbolized a new phase in imperial architecture, one that aimed to project centralized strength and permanence. However, the walls built by Qin were only maintained for a relatively short period. With the fall of the Qin dynasty and the rise of the Han, attention shifted toward diplomacy, trade, and military campaigns that pushed China's influence deeper into Central Asia. Still, the idea of a northern wall endured. The Han dynasty made repairs and extensions to the walls, especially in response to renewed threats from the Xiongnu. Their efforts highlighted the shifting balance between militarization and diplomacy, as they tried both to contain and to negotiate with northern tribes. The Han walls included innovations such as more permanent garrison posts and early warning systems using smoke signals and fire beacons, systems that would become standard in later periods. Even during times when the central government did not prioritize wall construction, local governors and frontier commanders continued to build regional defenses. These efforts were often driven by necessity rather than imperial directive. In the centuries following the Han, China went through periods of fragmentation and internal conflict, such as during the Three Kingdoms and later the Northern and Southern dynasties. During these times, the use of walls as military infrastructure became sporadic but no less important. Fortified towns and regional walls were common, particularly in northern China, where conflict with steppe nomads remained a constant concern. Some of these walls used stone in their construction, a shift from earlier reliance on rammed earth, indicating both technological development and a change in available resources or construction preferences. One significant example from this post-Han period comes from the Northern Wei dynasty, a regime founded by the Shanbei, a nomadic people who themselves settled and Sinicized. The Northern Wei constructed long walls in the north, understanding firsthand the importance of defensive lines in managing both external threats and internal stability. These walls not only defended territory, but also helped regulate migration and secure trade routes. The dual identity of the Northern Wei, as both former nomads and new rulers of Chinese lands, gave them a unique perspective on border management, which they applied to their construction efforts. Taoism, immortality, and the search for elixirs. Taoism, one of China's oldest and most influential philosophical traditions, emerged as both a spiritual guide and a way of life that emphasized harmony with the natural world, simplicity, and the pursuit of balance. Yet within its subtle teachings lay a profound fascination with immortality, not merely as a metaphorical ideal, but as a literal goal pursued by sages, emperors, and alchemists. This longing for eternal life led to centuries of exploration into nature's mysteries, culminating in the elaborate search for elixirs believed to grant physical immortality. At the heart of this quest was the belief that aligning oneself with the Tao, the underlying principle of the universe, could enable transcendence over decay, suffering, and death itself. In ancient China, death was not viewed simply as an end, but rather a transformation. Within the Taoist worldview, the boundary between life and death was permeable, governed by cycles much like the changing of seasons. The Tao, the ineffable way of the cosmos, was eternal, and those who could attune themselves to its rhythm might escape the fate of mortality. This aspiration found expression not only in philosophical discourse, but in elaborate rituals, meditative practices, and physical disciplines that aimed to preserve the vitality of the body. From breath control and dietary restrictions to meditations on the movement of qi, the life force, Taoist adepts developed systems intended to maintain youthfulness and extend life far beyond natural limits. The earliest Taoist texts, such as the Zhuangzi and parts of the Tao Te Ching, hinted at immortality more through allegory than prescription. They described immortals who moved with the wind, who drank dew, and whose bones were light as a bird's. These beings, sometimes referred to as Xian, were depicted as distant, semi-divine figures who had achieved a harmony so complete with nature that they no longer aged or died. For centuries, these accounts inspired both reverence and determination among followers seeking to replicate such feats. By the time of the Han Dynasty, the Taoist pursuit of immortality had evolved from abstract philosophy to practical alchemy. The court and the elite classes became increasingly intrigued by reports of hermits and mystics who claimed to have unlocked secrets to eternal life. Taoist alchemists began mixing minerals, herbs, and rare ingredients in the hope of discovering the fabled elixir of life. The ingredients ranged from cinnabar, mercury sulfide, gold, and jade, to exotic roots, fungi, and animal parts. These concoctions, often created in ritualistic settings with strict protocols, were consumed in small quantities by those desperate to transcend human frailty. The relationship between Taoism and imperial power deepened as successive emperors funded expeditions and laboratories devoted to alchemical experimentation. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, famously sent envoys across the seas in search of magical islands said to house immortals and their elixirs. Though none returned with such treasures, the legend of the quest persisted, fueling further efforts by later dynasties. For emperors, immortality promised continuity of rule and escape from the vulnerabilities that plagued mortal reigns. For the alchemists, the opportunity to serve the throne meant resources and protection, even if their work sometimes veered into dangerous territory. Ironically, many of the alchemical substances intended to prolong life hastened death. Cinnabar, one of the most common ingredients in Taoist elixirs, is toxic in its refined form. Numerous records tell of noblemen, monks, and even emperors who suffered madness, internal bleeding, or sudden death after ingesting these compounds. Yet despite such setbacks, the allure of immortality remained undiminished. The Taoist understanding of death as a problem to be solved rather than simply accepted motivated continued innovation and experimentation. Um, in parallel with external alchemy, a more internalized practice began to flourish, Naiden, or internal alchemy. This form of Taoist cultivation focused on transforming the body and spirit from within, without the need for ingesting substances. Practitioners of Naiden engaged in deep meditative states, visualized the circulation of vital energies, and harmonized the body's three treasures: Jing, essence; Qi, energy; and Shen, spirit. Through disciplined training, they believed they could purify their inner being, awaken latent forces, and ultimately merge with the Tao in a state of immortal spirit. This internal path to immortality was less hazardous and more accessible to the wider Taoist community. Monasteries and hermitages across the mountains became centers for such training, and many Taoist masters gained reputations not just for wisdom, but for extraordinary longevity and radiant health. Tales spread of sages who lived for centuries, who could vanish into mist, and who appeared ageless even in old age. Whether fact or legend, such stories reinforced the idea that immortality was not an illusion, but a reachable goal for the truly devoted. Alongside these efforts, Taoist cosmology played a central role in shaping how immortality was understood. The universe, according to Taoist belief, was structured in layers, with celestial realms inhabited by beings far removed from the earthly plane. Achieving immortality meant transcending not just physical death, but also the cycles of rebirth and karma that bound lesser souls. The Xian were not merely survivors of time, they had ascended into a purer existence, partaking in cosmic harmony beyond human comprehension. The mountains of China, particularly sacred peaks like Mount Penglai, Mount Kunlun, and the Zhongnan Range, became associated with these immortals. Pilgrims climbed them in search of revelation, while hermits lived among their cliffs in solitude, hoping to absorb their mystic energy. Temples and shrines dedicated to immortal figures were constructed, serving as both spiritual centers and places where alchemical studies quietly continued. The blending of myth, science, and spirituality in the Taoist search for immortality produced a unique cultural legacy. While many of the literal attempts at elixir production ultimately failed or proved fatal, the broader pursuit left behind profound insights into health, mindfulness, and the connection between humans and nature. Taoist practices such as Qigong, Tai Chi, and herbal medicine remain influential today, drawing from centuries of trial, error, and reflection, born out of the quest for eternal life. Moreover, the Taoist vision of immortality was never entirely about defying death. At its deepest level, it reflected a yearning to live in accordance with the universe, to achieve a stillness that outlasted the chaos of life. The alchemical fires, the endless scrolls of formulae, and the sleepless nights of meditation were as much about spiritual transformation as physical endurance. Immortality, in this sense, became a mirror of inner peace, of finding permanence in a world of impermanence. As dynasties rose and fell, as emperors lived and died despite their efforts, Taoism endured. Its view of immortality became more nuanced, often emphasizing spiritual elevation over bodily survival. By the time of the Tang and Song dynasties, Taoist scholarship had shifted toward refining Neidan and exploring the symbolic meanings of immortality, suggesting that transcendence need not be visible to be real. The true immortal, they proposed, could walk among men unnoticed, having shed all attachment and fear. He or she would not need palaces or potions, only the clarity of a mind attuned to the Tao. Despite this evolution, the dream of the elixir never fully faded. Even in the Ming and Qing periods, there were scholars, monks, and enthusiasts who revisited the old recipes, hoping to adjust the ratios, purify the ingredients, and perhaps succeed where others had failed. Manuscripts were passed down in secret, hidden from authorities who sometimes cracked down on alchemical experiments. The practice of seeking elixirs became a blend of tradition, rebellion, and personal devotion. Today, the Taoist legacy continues to inspire those who search for longevity, whether through modern science or spiritual discipline. Though the golden elixir remains a symbol more than a substance, its story reflects humanity's timeless desire to overcome the boundaries of time, illness, and death. In the Taoist world, where rivers flow without force and stones seem to outlast memory, the idea of immortality is not so much a conquest but a surrender to the eternal current of the Tao, which flows endlessly, carrying those who let go far beyond the limits of a single lifetime. Still, the bureaucratic legacy of legalism became an inseparable part of Chinese civilization. The civil service system, legal codification, and meritocratic ideals, even if imperfectly applied, bore the imprint of legalist thought. Despite its grim undertones, legalism contributed to the foundation of a professional state apparatus, where officials were judged by performance rather than noble birth, and where the machinery of the state continued to function beyond the life of any one ruler. These contributions were critical to the longevity of the Chinese imperial system, which endured in various forms for over 2 millennia. Legalism also left an intellectual imprint beyond China. In the broader East Asian context, elements of legalist governance were absorbed by neighboring cultures, particularly during periods of Chinese influence or occupation. In Korea and Japan, legal reforms inspired by Chinese models often carried with them the DNA of legalist discipline and centralization. These ideas did not always dominate, but their presence shaped the evolution of governance across the region, particularly in times of institutional formation. Yet, the name legalism still carries with it a sense of unease. It is rarely embraced as an ideal, but acknowledged as a reality, an unavoidable tool when ideals fall short. The fear-based control, though effective, is often seen as a last resort rather than a desirable norm. Nevertheless, the recurring appeal of legalism in times of instability is a sobering reminder of how fragile humanist governance can be when confronted with disorder. Legalism is not about what is right or just. It is about what works under duress. It is a doctrine forged in fire, shaped by war, and tempered by the desire for control at any cost. In modern discussions of governance, especially authoritarian regimes, legalism is often referenced, sometimes directly, often indirectly. The idea that order trumps freedom, that the collective is more important than the individual, and that law should be enforced without exception remains a potent undercurrent in political thought. These echoes are found not only in China, but in any system where the fear of chaos outweighs the desire for liberty. Legalism reminds us that the pursuit of control, once begun, can easily become an end in itself. In the final analysis, the legacy of legalism is a mirror reflecting the dual nature of governance, the need for order and the cost of enforcing it. It teaches that power, when unbalanced by compassion, may succeed in silencing dissent, but will struggle to win hearts. It warns that systems built on fear may endure, but they seldom inspire. And perhaps most of all, it illustrates that control without trust is always brittle, no matter how solid it seems. Legalism carved its mark not just into law codes and state archives, but into the psychological fabric of rule itself. Its ghost lingers in every political decision weighed between freedom and order, persuasion and coercion, justice and obedience. The rise of paper and the spread of knowledge. The invention and rise of paper was one of the most transformative moments in human history, not just for communication, but for the entire structure of civilization. It revolutionized how societies stored, transmitted, and preserved knowledge. Before paper, people relied on a range of costly and cumbersome materials such as clay tablets, bamboo slips, wooden tablets, parchment, or silk. These mediums were often expensive, fragile, and time-consuming to produce. They limited the scale and speed at which information could be copied and disseminated. The innovation of paper in ancient China was a pivotal turning point, born not out of leisure but necessity, and it would go on to become a foundational element in the global spread of learning, culture, and governance. The earliest known form of paper emerged during the Han Dynasty, traditionally attributed to a court official named Kai Lun in the early 2nd century CE. Though forms of paper-like materials existed before him, Kai Lun's contribution was to standardize and improve the process, using affordable and readily available materials like tree bark, hemp, rags, and old fishing nets. The resulting product was light, durable, and relatively easy to produce. More importantly, it drastically lowered the cost of written communication. In a time when knowledge was largely restricted to elites, the affordability of paper hinted at the possibility of broader access to information. Once the method of papermaking spread beyond China, it set off a silent revolution. Initially carried westward through trade routes such as the Silk Road, the technology made its way into Central Asia and the Islamic world by the 8th century. In the aftermath of the Battle of Talas in 751 CE, where Tang Chinese forces clashed with the Abbasid Caliphate, Chinese papermakers were reportedly captured and brought to Samarkand. This moment marked a decisive point in the diffusion of papermaking across cultures. Muslim artisans further refined the process, improving the quality of the pulp and introducing water-powered mills for mass production. These improvements allowed paper to take on a central role in the Islamic Golden Age, aiding the growth of libraries, schools, and scholarly traditions in cities such as Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. The Islamic world became a crucial conduit for transmitting paper technology to Europe. Through North Africa and Islamic Spain, the knowledge of paper production trickled into Europe by the 12th century. Initially met with skepticism due to its association with the East and the unknown, paper eventually found favor for its practicality. European parchment, made from animal skins, was both expensive and time-intensive to produce, making paper a welcome alternative once it was better understood. With time, papermaking centers began to spring up in Italy and France. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Europe had fully embraced the material, and the written word started to flourish on an unprecedented scale. The impact of paper on education and administration was immediate and profound. As it became cheaper and more available, the need to commit everything to memory diminished. Schools, bureaucracies, and religious institutions began to keep organized records and written texts. Monks and scribes were no longer the sole keepers of knowledge. Paper allowed the expansion of literacy beyond the clergy and elite scholars. Books became more common, and with them came the gradual democratization of information. People who once lived entire lives without encountering a written page were now learning to read psalters, chronicles, and legal codes written on paper sheets that circulated widely. Perhaps the most dramatic shift occurred with the invention of the movable type printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century. While printing itself was an old concept developed in China, the fusion of paper with Gutenberg's press system created an explosion of information production in Europe. The mass printing of books, pamphlets, and documents sparked the intellectual upheaval of the Renaissance and later the Reformation. Paper made it possible for Martin Luther's theses to spread across Germany in a matter of weeks. The availability of paper meant that printed ideas could travel far and fast, empowering people to engage with texts and form independent opinions. This sudden access to ideas, histories, and scientific observations shattered long-standing monopolies on knowledge. Paper also played a foundational role in the growth of governance and record-keeping. As states became more complex, they required systems to administer justice, collect taxes, and manage populations. Paper became the unseen backbone of empires, preserving edicts, treaties, censuses, and diplomatic correspondence. The expansion of bureaucratic institutions during the medieval and early modern periods was deeply tied to the availability of affordable paper. Governments could now archive vast amounts of information, facilitating continuity across reigns and enabling more intricate control over far-flung territories. In trade and commerce, paper allowed for the creation of contracts, receipts, ledgers, and promissory notes, turning economies into systems of trust and calculation, rather than barter and memory. This transformation was particularly evident in the merchant cities of Renaissance Italy, where paper-fueled documentation gave rise to the complex financial instruments that underpin modern banking. Without paper, these systems would have been nearly impossible to manage or scale. It was no coincidence that the rise of great trading powers, Venice, Genoa, and later Amsterdam and London, was accompanied by a parallel rise in paper-based bureaucracy and accounting. Beyond its functional uses, paper also became a medium of creative and cultural expression. It offered a surface for drawing, poetry, calligraphy, and storytelling. Artistic traditions that had been restricted to oral performance or mural painting could now be preserved and transmitted across generations. In East Asia, Brushwork on paper elevated poetry and painting into refined art forms, celebrated and shared among scholars and aristocrats. In the Islamic world, calligraphers used paper to craft verses of deep spiritual and philosophical meaning, adorned with geometric designs and vibrant pigments. In Europe, illuminated manuscripts gave way to printed books, but the tradition of embellishment and illustration lived on, evolving with the technology. The global voyage of paper continued through colonial encounters, maritime exploration, and imperial expansion. As empires carved their paths across continents, they brought with them the written word on paper. Missionaries, administrators, and scholars carried paper texts to the Americas, Africa, and parts of Southeast Asia. In many cases, it was the first exposure these regions had to systematic writing, record keeping, and documentation. Paper became a tool not only of education and religion, but also of administration and control. It enabled colonial powers to map, categorize, and exert authority over unfamiliar lands and peoples, often replacing or suppressing indigenous systems of communication and knowledge. Even as the Industrial Revolution introduced new materials and technologies, paper remained central to human society. Factories churned out paper in enormous quantities, supporting newspapers, legal systems, schools, and scientific institutions. Paperwork as a concept became synonymous with bureaucracy itself. The modern world's dependence on paper extended into virtually every domain: government offices, corporate ledgers, scientific journals, literary publishing, and even revolutionaries' manifestos. Despite the rise of digital technology in the 20th and 21st centuries, paper's legacy remains deeply embedded in the cultural and intellectual fabric of civilizations. Digital archives may store billions of documents, but the original foundation was built on fibers pressed, dried, and inked by hand. The very architecture of data systems, academic formats, and legal documentation is derived from conventions established during the reign of paper. The printed page still holds a symbolic authority and emotional resonance that screens struggle to replicate. From handwritten letters to official certificates, paper retains a tactile authenticity that continues to matter in courts, rituals, and personal milestones. The journey of paper from humble mulberry fibers to a global medium of enlightenment is a story of adaptation and transformation. It is not merely a tool, but a witness to human ambition, curiosity, and resilience. Across centuries and civilizations, paper enabled thoughts to escape the limits of time and geography. It preserved memories, sparked revolutions, settled disputes, and carried imagination to distant minds. More than an invention, it became a mirror of human progress, quiet, pliable, and ever-enduring. As the influence of paper expanded across the globe, it began to shape not only the storage and spread of knowledge, but also the very nature of how civilizations thought, planned, and envisioned their futures. In every corner of the world touched by paper, it slowly rewired the collective consciousness. For the first time in history, people could record events in real time and return to them later with the benefit of hindsight. They could draft ideas, edit, and refine them, creating a dynamic process of thinking that could stretch across generations. Unlike oral traditions, where each retelling risked distortion, the written word on paper offered consistency and precision. This allowed for the construction of vast historical narratives, political ideologies, and scientific treatises that could be built upon by successive thinkers and leaders. One of the less obvious impacts of paper was its role in shaping time. In societies where oral knowledge was dominant, the present often held greater weight than the future. Planning was short-term, and memory was communal. With the advent of written calendars, agricultural logs, and tax records, all preserved on paper, people began to think differently about time. Seasonal patterns could be analyzed, taxes could be predicted, and long-term planning became possible. Paper made the past visible and the future plannable. This shift gave rise to more sophisticated bureaucracies and administrative foresight, laying the groundwork for large-scale urban planning, infrastructure projects, and legal reforms. In education, paper became both a medium and a method. It allowed for the widespread creation of curriculum-based learning. Teachers no longer had to rely solely on recitation and oral correction. They could hand out written assignments, track progress, and provide personalized feedback. Students could take notes, revise them, and revisit concepts at their own pace. With paper, learning moved from a purely auditory experience into a multisensory one, combining sight and touch with the mental process of reflection. In the Islamic world, madrasas blossomed into centers of scholarship, aided by accessible manuscripts. In medieval Europe, paper transformed monasteries into book copying hubs, and later, universities adopted it as the backbone of academic exchange. Meanwhile, in China, Korea, and Japan, the influence of paper led to literary and philosophical renaissances. In China, the printing of Confucian texts helped unify moral teachings across the empire. In Korea, the creation of movable metal type further accelerated the publishing of religious texts and historical chronicles. In Japan, paper was not only used for writing, but evolved into an essential component of daily life, from ceremonial documents and government edicts to art forms like origami, ukiyo-e prints, and hand-painted poetry scrolls. In all these cultures, paper took on a role beyond that of a vessel for knowledge. It became part of cultural identity. In the political realm, paper introduced a new level of accountability. Rulers began issuing written laws, charters, and proclamations that could be scrutinized, debated, and archived. This documentation reduced the ambiguity of oral commands and made government actions more transparent. Treaties between nations or city-states were no longer based solely on the word of emissaries. They were inscribed and sealed, creating tangible evidence of agreements. This change strengthened diplomacy and legal order, reducing the risks of misinterpretation or denial. In time, paper would become the stage upon which revolutions and reforms were played out. Pamphlets challenging authority, constitutions establishing new orders, and declarations of independence echoed across continents through the silent medium of ink on fiber. In the world of science, the significance of paper was equally monumental. It allowed for the precise recording of experiments, the publication of observations, and the systematic comparison of data. In the absence of reliable recording tools, early scientists used paper journals to sketch instruments, chart the motion of stars, and track chemical reactions. These records, sometimes dismissed as rudimentary, often laid the groundwork for future discoveries. The ability to replicate findings became a cornerstone of the scientific method, and paper was its indispensable ally. Astronomers, alchemists, botanists, and physicians from different nations could correspond, share findings, and debate theories, fostering an international community of inquiry long before the internet or radio. Moreover, paper was instrumental in mapping the world. As navigation and exploration surged in the age of discovery, maps became crucial tools. Cartographers meticulously charted coastlines, trade routes, and newly encountered lands. These maps, copied and improved upon by hand or print, allowed for better planning of sea voyages and territorial conquests. Paper maps enabled empires to dream of expansion and understand the scale of their dominions. The power to visualize the world from above, even symbolically, changed how humans saw their place in the global structure. Without paper, the intricate networks of colonial trade and maritime navigation that defined the early modern era would have been far more chaotic and uncertain. Even in realms that were deeply personal, paper served as a silent companion. Diaries, letters, and memoirs became vessels for the private self. Individuals could now reflect upon their own lives, record dreams, articulate fears, or express love with a permanence that oral confessions could not provide. The human voice, once fleeting, was now captured in ink, traveling across distances and preserved for future generations. Historians and biographers would later use these intimate records to reconstruct not only events but emotions, giving voice to people who would otherwise have been forgotten. Paper also transformed the world of justice. Legal proceedings, once dominated by verbal testimony, began to rely on documented evidence. Contracts, wills, birth records, and land deeds were all stored on paper, creating layers of legal security and complexity. As societies evolved, this accumulation of written material became essential for rights enforcement, inheritance disputes, and land ownership claims. A person's identity, assets, and obligations were no longer bound to communal memory or social rank. They were embedded in signed sheets stored in archives. The very idea of a paper trail emerged from this system of documentation, forever tying paper to the machinery of law and governance. Throughout the centuries, paper continued to adapt. In times of war, it became a weapon of persuasion, used for propaganda, coded messages, and battlefield maps. During peacetime, it served as a mirror to culture and aesthetics. Printing houses competed to produce more beautiful editions of classical texts. Newspapers flourished, offering people a daily connection to the wider world. Posters, bulletins, and political cartoons became tools of satire and civic engagement. Paper, in this way, evolved from a utilitarian object into a shaper of public consciousness. Colonial empires, while often exploitative, further extended paper's reach. Colonial administrators used it to govern distant territories, impose new laws, and introduce schooling systems based on European models. In some regions, traditional oral systems were replaced or forcibly displaced by a new dependence on written codes. While this often led to cultural erasure, it also facilitated new blends of expression. Local scholars adopted paper for documenting indigenous history, reinterpreting traditions, and resisting colonization through written critique. In the 19th century, industrial-scale papermaking emerged, revolutionizing access to print material. With machines replacing manual labor, newspapers and books became affordable to the working class. Literacy campaigns found fertile ground. Entire populations began to read about politics, science, philosophy, and literature in their own languages. Revolutions of thought, such as those surrounding abolitionism, feminism, socialism, and nationalism, gathered momentum through cheaply printed leaflets and manifestos. The printed word moved beyond ivory towers and into streets, factories, and marketplaces. In classrooms, textbooks printed on mass-produced paper became the standard. Public education systems began forming national curricula, distributing standardized knowledge to children across diverse regions. Paper tests, exercises, and assignments became everyday rituals in students' lives, offering not only content, but a method for evaluation and accountability. Teachers kept gradebooks, students had notebooks, and administrators issued certificates. Each item held weight, meaning, and permanence due to its existence on paper. By the 20th century, paper had become inseparable from human activity. Governments rose and fell with constitutions penned on it. Peace treaties and war declarations alike carried inked signatures. Art, science, religion, and politics all leaned on paper for survival and propagation. Even as film, radio, and television emerged, paper retained its dominance because it could be touched, owned, archived, and annotated. People still gathered in libraries to study dusty manuscripts and rare editions, seeking the ideas that had changed their world. Institutions were built not only of stone and brick, but also of archives filled with yellowing documents that held the keys to generations of knowledge. As digital alternatives arrived in the late 20th century, many feared that paper would fade into obscurity. Yet its decline was neither swift nor total. Paper proved durable, especially in contexts where authenticity and tangibility mattered. Official records, legal documents, ceremonial decrees, and artistic prints all continued to rely on it. Its very physicality became its strength. People trusted paper in ways they hesitated to trust screens or files that could vanish with a system crash. The handwritten note, the signed contract, the printed photograph, all remained emotionally and culturally significant. Today, we live in a world straddling the digital and the physical, but paper continues to shape our rituals and record our lives. From the first papermaking workshops in Han China to the ink-stained fingers of Renaissance scribes, and from revolutionary tracts to childhood notebooks, paper has served as both witness and participant in the story of human progress. It taught us how to preserve knowledge, share it, challenge it, and renew it. As long as humans value memory, identity, and expression, paper will never be merely a relic. It will remain a quiet but enduring force behind how we think, create, and remember. Peasant life in the shadow of dynasties. In the grand sweep of imperial history, it is easy to be swept up by the accomplishments of emperors, the drama of palace intrigue, and the might of armies that redrew borders. Yet, beneath the towering banners of dynasties, the overwhelming majority of people lived quiet, grueling, and often invisible lives. These were the peasants, those who tilled the land, wove the cloth, fetched the water, and bore the weight of empire upon their bent backs. Peasant life under dynastic rule was not marked by glory or luxury, but by endurance. It was a life molded by soil, dictated by the seasons, and constrained by a system that rarely paused to acknowledge their existence beyond tax rolls and census scrolls. From the earliest dynasties in ancient China to the feudal systems of medieval Europe and the structured agrarian economies of the Islamic world, peasants formed the economic bedrock. Without their labor, no citadel could rise, no court could feast, and no army could march. Yet the rhythms of their lives often went unrecorded. Theirs was a world of repetition, planting, harvesting, praying for rain or for mercy from locusts, disease, or soldiers on campaign. Most peasants were born to land they did not own, bound either legally or by tradition to a parcel of earth passed down not as inheritance but as obligation. Daily life for a peasant was physically demanding and mentally taxing. Before the sun rose, the household would already be stirring, with the eldest preparing for the day's toil and the youngest lending hands where they could. Fields had to be plowed with rudimentary tools, often wooden and reliant on oxen or manual force. Sowing seeds required attention and patience, for one poor planting could mean a winter of hunger. The act of harvesting, especially during the peak of summer, was both a relief and a trial. Relief that crops had matured, and trial in the unrelenting heat and backbreaking repetition of cutting and gathering. In many societies, the produce of a peasant's labor did not remain fully in their hands. Dynasties enforced complex tax systems, either in grain, labor, or coin. Whether through corvée, forced labor on state projects, or through regular tributes to landowners, temples, or lords, a peasant rarely kept more than a fraction of what they produced. These obligations varied from empire to empire. In ancient Mesopotamia, they might be expected to dig irrigation canals. In medieval Japan, they might be compelled to provide rice for a samurai estate. In Mughal India, they paid land revenue that directly fed the opulence of the court. And yet, through it all, the fields were always calling, demanding another planting. Peasants were not ignorant of the systems they lived under, nor were they always passive. Folk songs, oral stories, and local customs reveal a quiet resistance, sometimes through evasion, sometimes through flight to the forested margins of society. In extreme circumstances, peasant uprisings erupted not from a desire to claim the throne, but from a desperate yearning for fairness. These uprisings were rare but significant. The Red Turban Rebellion in Yuan, China, the German Peasants' War, and various revolts under Roman or Byzantine rule show how unbearable taxation or natural disasters could push a peasantry to the edge. However, more often than not, such revolts were suppressed brutally, with surviving peasants returning to their fields under heavier chains. Homes for peasants were basic and dictated by the availability of local materials. In northern China, sun-dried bricks might be used. In Europe, wattle and daub with thatched roofs were common. In Egypt or Mesopotamia, mud brick was the standard. These dwellings were often single-roomed, shared with animals during harsh seasons, and only provided the barest protection from the elements. Sanitation was minimal, and disease was a constant presence, made worse by poor diets, contaminated water, and the crowding of entire families in small quarters. Clothing was simple, spun from coarse cloth, dyed in earthy tones when dyes could be spared. Shoes were a luxury. More often, calloused feet served as the peasants' boots. The role of women in peasant life was central, though rarely given separate recognition in chronicles. They were not only caregivers and mothers, but laborers, managers of the household economy, and in many cases, herbalists or informal midwives. A woman would rise early to grind grain, tend to livestock, draw water, and assist in the fields. During planting or harvest seasons, entire families, children included, worked from dawn to dusk. In such a setting, there was little time for leisure, and what little there was might be filled with religious observance, local festivals, or the telling of ancestral stories. Education was virtually inaccessible. Most peasants were illiterate, not from lack of intelligence, but from lack of opportunity. Written language was the domain of scribes, clerics, or state officials. Nonetheless, peasants preserved knowledge through oral traditions. Songs, proverbs, and seasonal lore passed from generation to generation served as their encyclopedia. These cultural tools were essential for farming success, social cohesion, and spiritual understanding. A peasant might not read a calendar, but they knew the sky and the smell of the earth. They didn't record philosophy, but they pondered fairness and justice in their own way under the stars. Religion and spirituality were deeply embedded in peasant existence. For many, divine favor was as important as rainfall. In East Asia, rituals to local deities or ancestors were common. In Christian Europe, saints and sacraments offered comfort amid hardship. In Islamic lands, daily prayers were observed even by those in the fields. Temples, shrines, or local holy sites served as both spiritual centers and rare community gathering points. These were moments of relief from daily burdens and offered a chance to connect with something beyond the toil. Nature itself was both a partner and a threat. While peasants lived in constant connection with the land, they were at its mercy. A flood could destroy a year's work. A drought could spell famine. Locusts, pests, or blight brought suffering not only to crops, but to entire communities. Without modern technology, there were no guarantees. Hunger was a recurring chapter in the peasant's story, and often the elite were sheltered from it by distance or privilege. When famine struck, it was the peasant body that shrank, the peasant child that cried from emptiness, the peasant family that disappeared without record. The lives of peasants, though often defined by hardship, were not devoid of meaning or joy. In the interstices between sowing and reaping, there were weddings, births, songs, dances, and celebrations of the seasons. Bonds between neighbors were strong, formed through shared work and survival. Humor found a place even in difficult conditions through jokes, riddles, or stories mocking the rich. Though the dynasties recorded their victories in stone and silk, the peasantry carved their legacy in lived resilience, in the way they could endure, adapt, and hope. Dynasties came and went, names changing on banners and edicts, but the field remained. The tax collector changed uniforms, the law changed tongues, but the furrowed rows still needed hands. Sometimes the dynasty promised reform, offered relief, or granted amnesties, but these were often fleeting. When change came, it was slow and usually sparked by disaster, war, or the collapse of an old order. Even so, for many peasants, it was not revolution that mattered, but the chance to survive another winter, to see a child grow to adulthood, or to bury their dead with dignity. Peasant children inherited not just their parents' burdens, but their knowledge. A father taught his son the rhythm of the plow. A mother taught her daughter the timing of planting herbs. These lessons were not found in books, but in gesture, repetition, and quiet observation. The education of a peasant child was practical, preparing them for survival in a world that offered few choices. Dreams might exist of freedom, prosperity, or escape, but they had to be carefully folded away beneath layers of realism, duty, and tradition. As centuries passed, and as technology crept into the countryside, some things began to shift. Water mills, better plows, and crop rotations improved productivity. Yet even then, access to such innovations was unequal, and many peasants still toiled with tools barely changed from generations prior. In some cases, land reforms did allow a few peasants to own their fields. In others, enclosures, debt, or war pushed them further into despair. The industrial era would eventually redraw the map of peasant existence, transforming them into factory workers or displacing them into cities. But in many parts of the world, peasant life lingered long into the modern era. To understand the peasant is to understand the true weight of history. Not the banners that fluttered atop palaces, but the hands that wove those banners. Not the emperors crowned in gilded halls, but the voices that cheered or remained silent in the crowd. The peasant stood not at the front of history, but beneath it, holding it aloft. And though history books often overlook them, every brick in a wall, every grain in a storehouse, every coin in an imperial treasury was once touched by their labor. Dynasties ruled, but it was the peasants who made the world work. Their suffering sustained empires, their toil built civilizations, and their perseverance ensured that even in the harshest of centuries, life continued. Ancient Chinese medicine and the balance of forces. In ancient China, medicine was not merely a collection of remedies for illness, but a profound system of thought that mirrored the universe itself. It was born not in laboratories, but in observation of the stars, the wind, the seasons, the human body, and the rhythms of nature. Health was not defined by the absence of disease, but by the presence of harmony. Illness, in turn, was seen as the disruption of balance, a disharmony in the ceaseless interplay of forces within and beyond the human body. At the heart of this system were the twin concepts of yin and yang, and the belief that life was governed by the dynamic equilibrium of opposing yet complementary forces. These ancient physicians viewed the body as a microcosm of the cosmos, reflecting the same principles that governed the earth, sky, and heavens. Just as the sun and moon alternated in the sky, so too did warmth and cold, activity and rest, fullness and emptiness circulate through the human frame. Yin, representing coolness, darkness, passivity, and substance, was forever intertwined with yang, the force of heat, light, action, and energy. Neither could exist without the other, and both were necessary for health. Disease was interpreted as an excess or deficiency in either yin or yang, a sign that the internal balance had been lost due to lifestyle, environment, emotion, or other disturbances. Rather than isolate a single organ or symptom, Chinese medical practitioners sought to understand the interconnection of all things. The body was mapped not through dissection, but through sensation, pulse reading, and centuries of accumulated experience. They believed in a network of pathways called meridians, invisible channels through which qi, the vital life energy, flowed. This qi was not static, but moved in cycles, influenced by the organs, the environment, and even by thought. When qi was abundant and flowing freely, one felt vibrant and alert. When it stagnated or was depleted, illness took root. These concepts led to treatments that emphasized restoring the natural flow of energy rather than directly attacking disease. The five elements theory also underpinned much of ancient Chinese medical thought. Wood, fire, earth, metal, and water were not merely physical materials, but symbolic categories that explained natural relationships. Each element corresponded with particular organs, emotions, seasons, and colors. For instance, wood was linked to the liver in springtime, fire to the heart and summer, and so on. These associations helped physicians diagnose imbalances by observing not only physical symptoms but also emotional states and environmental conditions. A person suffering from excessive anger, for example, might be said to have an overactive liver or a disturbance in the wood element. Diagnosis was an art as much as a science. The physician would observe the patient's complexion, listen to the quality of their voice and breathing, smell for signs of internal decay, inquire about sleep, appetite, and dreams, and most critically, read the pulse. A pulse diagnosis in Chinese medicine was far more intricate than the simple measure of heart rate in modern practice. Practitioners trained for years to detect subtle changes in rhythm, strength, and quality, with over 24 distinct types of pulses identified, each corresponding to a different imbalance or internal condition. The wrist was read in 3 positions and at different depths, allowing the practitioner to assess the state of the internal organs without opening the body. Treatment followed principles that were gentle, indirect, and rooted in natural law. Herbal medicine was central, employing thousands of substances, roots, barks, seeds, and minerals, combined in specific formulas tailored to the individual's constitution. These remedies were rarely meant to suppress symptoms directly. Instead, they were crafted to correct underlying imbalances, strengthen the body's natural defenses, and guide qi back to its proper flow. Some herbs were warming, others cooling. Some moved qi, others nourished blood or anchored yang. The combination and proportion of herbs required great skill, and ancient texts like the Shennong Benqiao Jing laid out the foundations for what would become one of the most enduring pharmacopoeias in history. Acupuncture was another tool, based on the idea that inserting fine needles into specific points along the meridians could influence the flow of qi and restore harmony. It was believed that illness caused blockages or deficiencies in the energy channels, and by stimulating the right points, a practitioner could encourage balance and relieve pain or dysfunction. Moxibustion, the burning of dried mugwort on or near the skin, was also used to warm meridians and dispel cold or dampness from the body. Cupping, massage techniques like tuina, and movement practices such as tai chi and qigong complemented the medical arsenal, each promoting circulation, relaxation, and internal harmony. Food was not separated from medicine in the ancient Chinese worldview. Dietetics was considered a foundational pillar of health, with foods classified not only by nutritional value but by their energetic qualities. Some were warming, like ginger and lamb, others cooling, like cucumber or watermelon. The balance of flavors, sour, bitter, sweet, pungent, and salty, was also important. Eating in harmony with the seasons and in moderation was seen as essential to maintaining health. Overindulgence, irregular meals, or excessive cold or raw foods could disturb the digestive fire and lead to long-term imbalance. Mental and emotional well-being were deeply integrated into this model of health. Emotions were thought to arise from the internal organs and to affect them in turn. Prolonged sadness might damage the lungs, while excessive worry could harm the spleen. The goal of medicine was not only to treat physical ailments, but to foster a calm, balanced mind. Meditation, breathing exercises, and moral cultivation were considered essential for longevity and health. A virtuous life, lived in accordance with natural rhythms and social harmony, was seen as protective against disease. Ancient Chinese medicine also reflected the political and philosophical ideals of the time. A good physician, like a good ruler, did not impose control by force, but guided with wisdom and restraint. Illness was not fought, but resolved. Harmony, both within the body and in society, was the highest aim. The influence of Confucian ethics, Taoist cosmology, and even legalist order can all be traced in the language and practice of medical texts. The body was not seen as an isolated machine, but as a living, breathing ecosystem constantly interacting with the world. Medical education was rigorous and steeped in classical knowledge. Aspiring physicians studied canonical works like the Huangdi Neijing, or Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, which remains one of the foundational texts of Chinese medicine. It was structured as a dialogue between the legendary Yellow Emperor and his ministers, discussing everything from the structure of the body to causes of disease, treatment strategies, and seasonal changes. This text was more than a manual. It was a philosophy, offering insight into how to live in balance with nature. While ancient Chinese medicine lacked the anatomical precision of later Western biomedicine, it excelled in its holistic vision. It acknowledged that people are shaped not only by biology, but by climate, society, spirit, and time. This worldview allowed it to flourish across dynasties and adapt to changing times while retaining its core belief in the unity of all things. The physician's task was not to dominate illness, but to understand it, to read the signs of nature, and to restore the lost balance that gave rise to suffering. Over the centuries, Chinese medicine developed alongside evolving dynastic cultures, military innovations, and technological changes. But its foundation, the balance of yin and yang, the flow of qi, and the resonance of the five elements, remained constant. Even as other cultures introduced new ideas and techniques, Chinese medicine absorbed them thoughtfully, always integrating them into its system, rather than replacing its principles. The result was a living tradition, one that could evolve while staying rooted in its philosophical core. This system of medicine did not remain confined within China's borders. It traveled along the Silk Road, influenced neighboring cultures, and in many places integrated with local practices. Korean, Japanese, and Vietnamese medicine all bear traces of Chinese influence, and even today, traditional Chinese medicine continues to be practiced around the world. In modern times, as interest in holistic health resurges, the teachings of ancient Chinese healers are being re-examined not as relics of a bygone era, but as valuable insights into how to live in harmony with our bodies and the world around us. Though millennia have passed, the wisdom of ancient Chinese medicine endures in its simplicity and depth. It teaches that to heal is not only to cure disease, but to cultivate balance, to listen to the rhythms of life, to observe gently, and to respect the invisible threads that connect all things. Whether through the quiet ritual of brewing herbs, the precise placement of an acupuncture needle, or the stillness of meditative breath, the ancient Chinese physician offered not just treatment, but a path to restore the harmony between body, spirit, and universe. Catastrophe and rebirth, floods, famines, and revolts. Throughout history, the rhythm of civilizations has often been punctuated by catastrophes, natural and human-made, that have shaken the foundations of empires and communities. These calamities, far from mere interruptions, became crucibles where new orders were forged and societies reborn. In the annals of human development, floods, famines, and revolts have not only tested endurance, but also catalyzed transformation, reshaping societies, belief systems, and even governance structures. The cycles of collapse and revival were not just chaotic intervals, but profound turning points that often laid the groundwork for renewal. Floods, as both destroyers and life-givers, were among the most paradoxical forces in the ancient world. The seasonal flooding of rivers, such as the Nile, the Yellow River, and the Tigris-Euphrates, shaped early civilizations. While predictable inundations nourished agriculture and enabled prosperity, Unpredictable or excessive flooding turned prosperity into ruin. The Yellow River in China was both a cradle and a curse for early Chinese dynasties. Repeated flooding displaced millions, drowned cities, and destroyed food supplies. These deluges often eroded the legitimacy of ruling dynasties, who were expected to maintain harmony between heaven and earth. When the floods came unbidden, they were seen not merely as environmental misfortunes, but as divine disapproval. The erosion of confidence in leadership frequently gave rise to social unrest and rebellion, feeding cycles of dynastic collapse and reformation. Similarly, famines emerged as silent catastrophes, creeping across lands and withering human hope. Droughts, crop failures, locust invasions, or poor administrative policies could lead to widespread hunger. In societies heavily reliant on a single harvest or grain supply, even one failed season could spell disaster. The Chinese concept of the heavenly mandate rested heavily on the ruler's ability to provide for the people. When food shortages became chronic, the moral authority of the emperor was questioned. In medieval Europe, the Great Famine of the early 14th century saw millions perish as incessant rain and failing crops led to widespread starvation. Desperation bred chaos. People turned on institutions, questioned divine favor, and sometimes erupted into violent resistance. Hunger was not simply a physical affliction. It destabilized entire political orders and sometimes altered the course of history more profoundly than battles. In the ancient Indian subcontinent, records mention successive famines that altered the composition of cities and rural life. As food became scarce, migrations occurred, crafts declined, and once thriving urban centers fell into decay. The stress of survival reshaped the cultural and economic fabric of society. Temples and religious authorities, often central to agricultural rituals and the management of granaries, either rose in prominence or were vilified depending on their perceived role in the crisis. The delicate balance between spiritual guidance and material responsibility meant that famines could either strengthen or dismantle traditional institutions. Revolts often followed in the wake of these catastrophes, fueled by desperation and the erosion of traditional social contracts. The pattern was familiar across time and geography. Disaster strikes, the people suffer, rulers are blamed, and rebellion ignites. In ancient Egypt, the first intermediate period was marked by political fragmentation that followed environmental decline. Failing Nile floods led to famine, which, in turn, weakened central authority. Local governors seized power and civil unrest grew. The unity of the Old Kingdom dissolved, giving way to an age of competing interests and eventual reformation. Even in collapse, new possibilities emerged. Eventually, from this period of instability, the Middle Kingdom rose, more centralized and reform-oriented, having learned from the previous system's fragility. In Ming China, the late dynasty saw a convergence of natural disasters, economic mismanagement, and corruption. Floods ravaged the northern provinces, and famine soon followed. As the imperial court became increasingly detached, popular discontent grew. Banditry, local militias, and full-scale rebellions began to tear at the empire's seams. One of the most famous uprisings, led by Li Zicheng, emerged during this period. Though his rebellion initially succeeded, it eventually fell, giving rise to the Manchu-led Qing dynasty. Thus, the collapse of one order, prompted by environmental catastrophe and social upheaval, cleared the stage for another to take its place. The role of infrastructure and administrative competence was central to how societies responded to catastrophes. In some cases, failure to manage canals, granaries, or food distribution systems revealed the weakness of regimes. The Roman Empire, despite its engineering prowess, struggled during periods of prolonged drought and pestilence. When famine hit Rome, the political fallout could be severe. The population, dependent on grain shipments from distant provinces, reacted violently to disruptions. Emperors who failed to provide were swiftly punished by mobs or replaced through intrigue. The decline of urban centers like Rome during the empire's later years was partly due to repeated failures in responding to environmental stress. In medieval Japan, recurring famines during the Kamakura and Muromachi periods intensified peasant dissatisfaction. Coupled with heavy taxation and military conscription, food scarcity triggered peasant uprisings that threatened the authority of the samurai elite. Although many revolts were localized and crushed swiftly, they reflected deep-rooted anxieties, and a growing awareness among the lower classes of their collective strength. These revolts were early signs of a shifting power dynamic that would later culminate in the restructuring of Japanese feudal society. Famines and floods also influenced religious and philosophical movements. In times of mass suffering, people often turned to new spiritual interpretations. In ancient China, the Taoist and Buddhist movements gained momentum during periods of instability and famine. Their teachings offered solace, explanations for suffering, and alternative paths of salvation or balance that contrasted with the dominant Confucian order. In India, religious reformations often followed natural disasters, as wandering ascetics and new sects gained followers disillusioned with the status quo. Faith became both a refuge and a force for societal change. The cycle of catastrophe and rebirth also extended to the arts and cultural identity. Literature, architecture, and visual arts responded to crises not only by mourning loss, but also by capturing resilience. After the Black Death ravaged Europe, survivors found themselves in a world transformed. Labor shortages led to better conditions for workers, while psychological shifts sparked changes in artistic expression. A deep fascination with death, fate, and the impermanence of life colored European art and literature in the late medieval and early Renaissance periods. Similarly, Chinese painting during the Yuan dynasty, formed in the wake of Mongol invasions and social dislocation, often focused on themes of solitude, nature, and internal contemplation, reflecting a collective search for meaning amid disarray. In Mesoamerica, civilizations like the Maya also experienced catastrophic cycles. Environmental degradation, prolonged droughts, and internal strife likely contributed to the collapse of major city-states. While these collapses ended the dominance of certain urban centers, they also allowed for the dispersal and transformation of Maya culture across the broader region. Traditions did not vanish. They morphed, reappearing in new forms and regions, preserving continuity even through apparent collapse. What emerges from the historical record is not a tale of endless suffering, but a pattern of regeneration. Catastrophes forced reassessments of values, systems, and identities. Some leaders responded with innovation, introducing new irrigation techniques, land reforms, or redistribution systems. Others fell under the weight of tradition, unable to adapt. The measure of a civilization was not its ability to avoid disaster, but how it rose again afterward. Renewal came not always through strength, but through flexibility, resilience, and a willingness to reimagine what society could be. Even as populations dwindled and cities emptied during great plagues, seeds of the future were planted. Those who remained often found themselves in a different world, one with labor shortages, shifting land ownership, and new political possibilities. Peasant families sometimes gained land or better living conditions. Power structures were rearranged. In the wake of death, life reasserted itself with new priorities. The burden of rebuilding often fell to the ordinary, farmers, artisans, healers, who carried forward not only the remnants of the past, but also new ideas born of suffering. The echoes of these past cycles still resonate today. Modern disasters, be they floods intensified by climate shifts or famines driven by conflict and displacement, draw upon ancient patterns. Societies still struggle to respond, still grapple with questions of governance, equity, and justice during crisis. But as history shows, the capacity to rebuild is intrinsic to the human story. Time and again, when faced with devastation, people have turned their pain into purpose and their ruins into foundations for something new. In this long arc of history, floods, famines, and revolts do not merely mark endings. They mark thresholds, passages from one order to another. Behind each catastrophe lies the possibility of renewal, and within each collapse, the seeds of transformation are sown. The story of human civilization, then, is not one of uninterrupted ascent, but of rising again and again from the ash and the floodwaters, forging from calamity a new shape of life. Poetry, prose, and the scholar gentry class. Throughout Chinese history, poetry and prose were not simply artistic expressions. They were vital instruments of cultural prestige, intellectual refinement, and political power. Among the scholar gentry class, known as the literati or shidafu, mastery of written language was more than an academic pursuit. It was the key to influence and advancement. As the imperial bureaucracy evolved, especially from the Tang dynasty onward, written expression became inseparable from governance. The imperial examination system, designed to select officials based on merit rather than birth, revolved around literary skill. Aspiring scholars were required to compose essays, poems, and interpretations of Confucian texts with elegance, precision, and philosophical insight. Thus, poetry and prose were not confined to private reflection or artistic circles. They were embedded in the mechanisms of statecraft and the very architecture of power. From a young age, sons of the scholar gentry were immersed in the classics. Memorization, interpretation, and composition formed the core of their education. The 4 books and 5 classics of Confucianism were not just moral guides but stylistic templates. Language was not only a vehicle for ideas, but a reflection of one's moral standing. An elegant poem revealed inner harmony. A well-structured essay conveyed not just intellect, but integrity. The style of writing, its rhythm, structure, and moral tone became a measure of character. In this way, literature helped cultivate not just minds, but reputations. A scholar's verse could travel far beyond his home province, carried by word of mouth or copied into anthologies, earning admiration or even securing an invitation to court. The Tang dynasty was a golden age for poetry, and many of the era's greatest poets were also government officials. Figures like Du Fu and Li Bai navigated the world of administration and art simultaneously. Their works, while deeply personal at times, also engaged with political events, moral dilemmas, and the natural world in ways that elevated discourse across the empire. Poetry became a language of shared sensibility among the elite, a refined shorthand through which emotions, criticism, and ideals could be conveyed with subtlety. Even at court, where direct speech might be dangerous, a poem could veil dissent in metaphor, preserving the poet's safety while allowing the message to resonate. In this world, literary brilliance was as potent as martial skill or economic power. The Song dynasty further elevated prose, especially in the form of the 8-legged essay, which became a cornerstone of the imperial examination system. These rigidly structured essays tested a candidate's mastery of Confucian doctrine and their ability to argue complex moral issues through disciplined composition. Though criticized in later centuries for their formulaic nature, these essays were exercises in moral logic, demonstrating the writer's clarity of thought, rhetorical balance, and ethical orientation. For the scholar gentry, composing such essays was not merely about passing a test, it was about aligning oneself with the foundational values of the state. Their literary output became a kind of moral labor, reinforcing their position as cultural stewards and custodians of order. Outside the examination halls, writing served as a means of self-expression, spiritual inquiry, and social commentary. Literary gatherings often centered around poetry contests, philosophical debates, and calligraphy demonstrations. These events were not frivolous pastimes, but affirmations of status, intellect, and cultural belonging. A successful scholar was expected not only to govern well, but to write beautifully. Proficiency in literary arts demonstrated a deep engagement with tradition and a capacity for refined judgment. The best poets and prose writers were seen as living embodiments of Confucian ideals, balanced, thoughtful, and morally upright. The act of writing also had ritual significance. The brush was a tool of both creativity and cultivation. Writing with care and elegance was seen as a discipline that refined the heart-mind, Xin, echoing the Confucian belief that internal cultivation leads to external harmony. This extended to calligraphy, which the scholar gentry regarded not just as art, but as a spiritual practice. The way a character was formed, its flow, pressure, spacing, revealed the temperament and moral state of the writer. Thus, writing was a mirror of the soul and a bridge to the ideal self. Through poetry and prose, the scholar cultivated virtue, contributed to cultural continuity, and demonstrated his fitness for leadership. During periods of political turmoil, literature became a sanctuary and a subtle form of resistance. When dynasties fell or corruption rose, scholars often withdrew from official life and turned to poetry to express their sorrow, critique injustice, or search for philosophical solace. These writings were not passive laments, but acts of witness, preserving a moral record of times when the state had lost its way. Some of the most enduring works in Chinese literary history came from such moments of disillusionment, where poetry replaced policy as the scholar's principal voice. Even in exile, a poet could shape the conscience of his age. his verses remembered long after emperors had been forgotten. The scholar gentry also played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting literary heritage. They copied ancient manuscripts by hand, wrote commentaries, compiled anthologies, and maintained family libraries. Their homes often became informal academies, where young students were tutored not only in grammar and history, but in the moral subtleties of verse. The creation of literary societies and poetry clubs fostered a communal culture of learning and reflection. In these circles, writing was not just a solitary endeavor, it was a social act that linked past and present, teacher and student, tradition and innovation. The literary arts became the glue of a civilization that prized continuity as much as creativity. By the time of the Ming and Qing dynasties, the scholar gentry had become the definitive custodians of Chinese culture. Even as political power shifted, the moral and cultural authority of this class remained anchored in their command of language. Literature became a form of lineage, with famous poems and essays passed down like heirlooms, each generation adding its voice to the ancestral chorus. The civil service examination remained their gateway to power, but their true legacy lay in the ink they spilled, refined, deliberate, and deeply human. Whether through lyrical beauty or philosophical prose, their writings reflected a worldview that sought harmony between heaven, earth, and the human heart. In times of prosperity, literature celebrated peace, nature, and the benevolence of wise rule. In times of strife, it mourned loss and called for rectitude. Always it sought to elevate the spirit and sharpen the intellect. The scholar gentry's literary pursuits were therefore not ornamental, but essential. They shaped the moral compass of the empire, influencing everything from policy to family ethics. Their voices helped construct the cultural memory of China, ensuring that even in the absence of power, principle endured. Even as Western influences began to seep into China during the late imperial era, the scholar gentry continued to wield the pen with pride and resolve. Faced with the challenges of modernity, some turned to classical forms to affirm identity, while others experimented with new styles to engage with change. Yet the thread of continuity remained, the belief that language, when refined by moral purpose and intellectual discipline, could shape the destiny of a people. Poetry and prose were not mere relics of a bygone age, but living traditions that adapted to new currents, while honoring ancient truths. Ultimately, the legacy of the scholar gentry and their literary contributions reveals a society where intellect and virtue were intertwined, where governance demanded not just competence but cultivation. In this vision, a state was only as strong as the moral fiber of its officials, and that fiber was tested not just on the battlefield or in the court, but in the quiet act of writing. Through verse and essay, scholars carried the weight of their civilization's ideals, translating philosophy into policy, memory into legacy, and personal reflection into public wisdom. Their words did not vanish with the passing of dynasties. They remained etched in scrolls, echoed in halls of learning, and embedded in the fabric of a culture that revered thought as a form of leadership. In their poised brushstrokes and carefully chosen words, we see the contours of a world where beauty and duty were one. The poetry of a time reveals more than emotion, it reveals vision. The prose of a policy outlines more than law, it outlines character. And in the scholar gentry's literary heritage, we find not just a chronicle of Chinese civilization, but a mirror held up to the timeless aspiration of humankind, to think deeply, to speak wisely, and to live with purpose. From Han to chaos, the silent end of an era. The Han Dynasty, once the towering symbol of unity and strength in early Chinese civilization, did not fall in a blaze of glory or collapse under a single catastrophic blow. Rather, it decayed quietly, a majestic tree rotting from within, while its leaves still whispered of greatness. It was not a dramatic revolution or an invading horde that first broke the Han, but a slow erosion of the very structures that had sustained it. For centuries, the Han had represented a golden age of Chinese history. Its bureaucracy refined, its frontiers vast, its people largely prosperous under a Confucian order that prioritized harmony, duty, and moral governance. And yet, beneath that polished surface, hairline fractures began to appear, too subtle to notice at first, but destined to widen until the weight of the empire could no longer hold. The later years of the Han Dynasty were marred by a web of internal contradictions. The emperor, once a commanding presence at the heart of the state, gradually became a puppet of those who whispered closest to the throne. Palace eunuchs, once mere attendants, slowly amassed enough influence to shape imperial policy and sway succession. With every generation, they grew bolder, forming rival cliques within the inner court, conspiring not just with each other, but with court ladies, imperial relatives, and opportunistic generals. Their reach extended into the ministries, blurring the lines between personal favor and public duty. Ambitious men realized that success depended less on ability or service to the people and more on clever positioning within the court's invisible hierarchy. At the same time, the empire's outer provinces began to drift further from the center's control. Local warlords, once subordinate military commanders, began to establish semi-autonomous fiefdoms, justifying their growing independence as necessary for local defense or tax collection. Governors entrusted with the empire's welfare now carved out domains loyal first to themselves and only nominally to Luoyang, the imperial capital. In some cases, these regional rulers wielded more power than the court itself, controlling armies, raising revenues, and settling disputes without ever consulting the central administration. Yet the court, riddled with corruption and intrigue, was too consumed by its own crises to challenge them. Agricultural decline worsened the situation. A series of floods, droughts, and famines devastated the countryside, hitting small farmers the hardest. Many lost their lands, forced either into debt slavery or into becoming tenant farmers under wealthy landlords. As the disparity between the landholding elite and the peasantry widened, resentment grew. Imperial officials, often themselves from elite families, showed little interest in curbing this inequality. Instead, they passed policies that favored the rich, exacerbating the discontent that simmered in rural communities. The empire, though still grand in appearance, had become brittle at its core. Meanwhile, the Yellow Turban Rebellion erupted, not merely as a religious or mystical movement, but as a desperate cry from millions who had lost faith in their rulers. Led by Zhang Jue and his followers, it swept across the empire like a fever. While it was eventually crushed, the rebellion was more than just an insurrection. It was a signal that the foundations of the Han had cracked irreparably. It took an immense military campaign to suppress the revolt, draining the imperial treasury and giving unprecedented power to regional generals. These generals, once loyal to the throne, now found themselves indispensable, wielding armies that owed allegiance more to them than to the emperor. Among these rising military strongmen was Dong Zhuo, whose brief domination of the court illustrated just how far the imperial house had fallen. Marching into the capital under the pretense of restoring order, Dong Zhuo deposed a sitting emperor and installed a child he could control. His rule was brutal and paranoid, filled with purges, executions, and unchecked cruelty. Though his reign was short-lived, it shattered any lingering illusion of imperial dignity. The Han throne was no longer a seat of authority, but a prize to be fought over. Following Dongzhuo's death, the empire fractured further. What remained was not a united kingdom, but a splintered realm ruled by competing warlords, each claiming legitimacy, each maneuvering to seize the mandate of heaven. Names like Cao Cao, Sun Quan, and Liu Bei began to overshadow the emperor himself. These men ruled in the emperor's name, but clearly for their own ends. The imperial court, once the center of the known world, now functioned as a political pawn, shuffled from one stronghold to another, its decrees carrying only as much weight as the warlord who held it. The people suffered the most in this transition. What had been a functioning bureaucracy turned into a patchwork of private regimes. Entire regions were taxed multiple times by different authorities, while conscription bled rural villages of able-bodied men. Infrastructure crumbled, trade slowed, roads became dangerous, disease followed famine, banditry followed neglect. The social contract, once upheld by Confucian ideals, collapsed under the weight of survival. The dream of order and prosperity that the Han had once promised became a bitter memory for many. Cultural life, too, shifted. With no strong central patronage, artists, poets, and scholars either fled to the protection of local lords or faded into obscurity. The Confucian canon remained revered, but its ideals felt increasingly detached from the grim realities of civil war. In their place, other philosophies gained traction. Taoist mysticism offered solace, while some turned to folk beliefs or local cults for meaning and security. The decline of the Han was not just political, it was spiritual, intellectual, and emotional. A sense of disorientation crept across society, as if the very rhythm of time had been disrupted. Despite the darkness, there remained brief flickers of nobility. Some officials tried to govern justly, even as the state around them collapsed. Some generals protected civilians when they could have exploited them. In scattered pockets of the empire, ordinary people built fragile islands of stability. Villages defended by militias, towns that negotiated with bandits, local markets that still traded goods and news. But these were exceptions, not the rule. The broader pattern was one of decline. By the time the Han dynasty formally ended in 220 CE with the abdication of Emperor Xian, the event felt almost ceremonial. The empire had already ceased to function as a cohesive entity long before. Cao Pi, son of the powerful warlord Cao Cao, declared himself emperor of the new Wei dynasty, marking the start of the Three Kingdoms era. This transition, though historically significant, lacked the grandeur or finality of a traditional dynastic change. There was no moment of unified mourning, no national recognition of the dynasty's fall. The silence of the Han's end spoke louder than any trumpet or proclamation. And yet, the legacy of the Han did not vanish. Its language, laws, and cultural framework continued to shape Chinese civilization for centuries. Later dynasties would look back to the Han as a golden standard, invoking its name to legitimize their own rule. Even as the empire dissolved into competing states, the memory of the Han endured, woven into the identity of a people who had once lived under its wide and ancient sky. But for those who had watched its last days unfold, the feeling was not one of glory lost. It was the quiet ache of something once sacred slipping away unnoticed. The fall of the Han was not the story of a sudden collapse, but a gradual unraveling. Its grandeur faded not in fire, but in shadow, and in that shadow, new stories began of ambition, betrayal, resilience, and the search for unity that would haunt China for generations. For while the Han may have died in silence, the echoes of its fall would reverberate through every age that followed. Bronze Age brilliance, art, warfare, and ritual. The Bronze Age stands as one of humanity's most transformative chapters, a period that stitched together the early fabric of civilization through its mastery of metal, development of culture, and refinement of ritual. Spanning roughly from 3300 to 1200 BCE, this era emerged in various parts of the world, notably in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China, and the Mediterranean. It was marked by a shift from stone to metal tools, particularly bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, which altered the very way humans built, fought, traded, and worshipped. These changes were not mere technological upgrades. They were gateways to entirely new forms of living and thinking. In this age, humanity sharpened not only its weapons, but also its sense of self, art, and the divine. Art in the Bronze Age was more than ornamentation. It was a language carved in stone, cast in metal, and painted on pottery. Across cultures, one finds an explosion of creativity and symbolic expression, whether in the swirling motifs of Minoan frescoes, the geometric forms on Cycladic figurines, or the intricate designs found in Shang Dynasty bronzeware. These creations were not isolated works, but part of a larger visual grammar shared across regions. Artistic techniques evolved rapidly during this era. The potter's wheel, for example, revolutionized ceramics, allowing for greater symmetry and mass production. Metallurgy, too, gave rise to cast bronzes that weren't just functional, but often imbued with religious or political significance. These weren't items made for survival alone. They spoke of power, identity, and belief. Weapons and armor also experienced a leap in design and efficiency. Bronze, being harder than copper, offered a more durable and sharper edge, leading to the crafting of swords, spears, daggers, and arrowheads with greater killing power. Societies began to build standing armies, and warrior elites emerged who were defined by their access to such metal. This drove a social hierarchy where bronze itself became a symbol of status, sometimes hoarded by the powerful and denied to the lower classes. Warfare in the Bronze Age wasn't merely a clash of men, it was increasingly a clash of technologies. Chariots became instruments of speed and fear, changing the tactics of battlefields from slow-moving infantry clashes to rapid, mobile engagements that could decide the fate of entire kingdoms in a matter of minutes. These developments were not uniform, but the spread of ideas through trade and conquest allowed the best techniques to cross borders and grow stronger with every iteration. Trade routes expanded during this time, sometimes stretching thousands of miles. Tin and copper were rarely found in the same place, necessitating complex networks of exchange that crisscrossed deserts, forests, and seas. These connections not only allowed for the distribution of bronze tools and weapons, but also encouraged the sharing of ideas, languages, and religious symbols. Egyptian scarabs made their way to Mycenaean tombs. Mesopotamian cylinder seals turned up in Anatolia. This was an early globalization, one built not on digital speed, but on the slow, steady movement of ships, caravans, and oral agreements. Such trade depended heavily on trust and ritual, and in many cases, these interactions led to the fusion of beliefs, technologies, and artistic styles. Ritual in the Bronze Age was central to life and death. People did not merely live in communities, they lived under the gaze of gods and spirits they sought to appease through sacrifices, offerings, and festivals. Temples became the focal points of urban life, often housing not just priests, but also treasuries, archives, and schools. Religious ceremonies involved complex processions, chants, and dramatic reenactments, often performed at specific times aligned with celestial movements. Astronomy, while in its infancy, played a crucial role in these rituals. Monuments such as Stonehenge were constructed with astonishing accuracy to mark solstices and equinoxes, suggesting a deep understanding of the cosmos and its connection to divine timing. Death, too, was given sacred attention. Elaborate burial practices, such as those seen in the royal tombs of Ur or the shaft graves of Mycenae, reveal a belief in the afterlife and a desire to send the dead into the next world with all the grandeur their life had earned. These practices also helped solidify the political power of emerging kings and warlords. Rulers often claimed divine ancestry or special relationships with gods to justify their authority. Their palaces were not just residences, but temples in miniature, with sacred chambers and divine symbols etched into every surface. The boundary between political and spiritual leadership blurred, making rebellion not just a political act, but a religious offense. This intertwining of the sacred and the secular gave Bronze Age societies their characteristic stability. And when that stability cracked, as it did toward the end of the era, the collapse was felt across all dimensions of life. Yet the brilliance of the Bronze Age wasn't confined to those at the top. Common people participated in rituals, made art, and fought in wars. Villages were organized around communal granaries and wells, suggesting a shared investment in survival. Weavers, potters, smiths, and farmers formed the backbone of these societies. Their labor fed armies, clothed priests, and filled markets. Even in the smallest items, beads, combs, or gaming pieces, we can detect the hands of individuals who lived lives rich in routine, duty, and moments of quiet creation. Their contributions were rarely recorded, yet they enabled the flourishing of the more visible monuments and empires we remember today. One cannot understand this period without recognizing the role of myth. Stories of creation, heroic journeys, and divine battles were passed down orally, forming the early spiritual texts that would later inspire great religions and epics. These tales weren't merely entertainment. They were blueprints for moral behavior, political legitimacy, and communal identity. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, reflects not just literary brilliance, but the existential concerns of a people grappling with mortality, kingship, and the limits of human ambition. In these stories, the lines between history, religion, and imagination are thin, yet each played a part in shaping how Bronze Age people saw themselves and their place in the world. Bronze Age cities were marvels of early urban planning. Streets were sometimes laid out with surprising order, homes constructed with drainage systems, and citadels built with an eye toward defense as well as ceremony. The city of Mohenjo-Daro, for instance, displays an advanced grid layout and public sanitation, suggesting an organized civic life that placed high value on hygiene and structure. Similarly, cities like Knossos in Crete reflected both administrative complexity and artistic grandeur, filled with vibrant murals, large storage areas, and throne rooms that point to a society deeply involved in both governance and symbolic power. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age was not abrupt, but it marked the end of an era defined by its delicate balance of innovation, hierarchy, and harmony with the natural and supernatural worlds. As iron tools gradually replaced bronze, new power structures emerged, and the networks that had held the Bronze Age together began to dissolve. Many great civilizations of the period collapsed or transformed under pressure from natural disasters, invasions, and internal decay. Yet their legacy did not vanish. The foundations they laid in metallurgy, writing, urban development, and spiritual thought continued to shape the ages that followed. Even today, we look back on the Bronze Age with a sense of awe. Its achievements speak to a human desire to create beauty, impose order, and seek meaning. The gleam of bronze is not just the shimmer of a metal, but the reflection of a time when humanity first dared to mold the world with fire, story, and spirit. The artifacts uncovered in tombs and ruins are not merely relics. They are echoes of lives lived with intention and imagination. In their silent forms, we see not only what once was, but what might have been, the full tapestry of a world that shone with the first great brilliance of civilization, the power of the imperial examination system. The imperial examination system was one of the most powerful and transformative institutions in Chinese history, a mechanism that not only shaped the bureaucratic structure of the Chinese Empire for over a millennium, but also influenced the very fabric of society, education, and governance. It was a system that, through its rigorous and highly competitive processes, sought to identify talent from across the vast and diverse empire, offering a theoretical path to power based on merit rather than privilege or birthright. This foundational idea of selecting officials through scholarly ability rather than aristocratic lineage marked a monumental shift in governance and helped sustain the stability of imperial China through centuries of change and challenge. Originating in the Sui dynasty and reaching its mature form under the Tang and Song dynasties, the imperial examination system was designed to centralize administrative power by standardizing the criteria through which officials were appointed. Before its full implementation, most bureaucratic roles were inherited or handed out through patronage networks, often dominated by elite aristocratic families. The introduction of the examinations challenged this order, gradually eroding the influence of hereditary nobility and allowing for the inclusion of a broader social spectrum, albeit still limited by access to education. The tests were deeply rooted in Confucian philosophy, which emphasized moral integrity, filial piety, loyalty, and duty, qualities seen as essential for effective governance. Candidates were expected to memorize and interpret Confucian classics, compose poetry, and demonstrate refined literary skills, all while showcasing their intellectual discipline and alignment with the ideological values of the state. For centuries, success in the examination system became the dream of countless families, especially those from modest backgrounds who saw in it a rare opportunity for upward mobility. A single son's achievement in passing the highest level of the exams, the Jinshi degree, could elevate an entire clan, bringing honor, wealth, and political influence. This intense aspiration fostered a culture where education and scholarly discipline were held in the highest regard. Families would invest heavily in tutors, study materials, and years of preparation, often beginning a child's training at an early age. This societal focus on academic excellence contributed to the creation of a scholarly elite, known as the literati, who would form the backbone of imperial governance. The examinations were not only tests of intellect, but also of psychological endurance and moral strength. Candidates would endure days of isolation in small examination cells under strict supervision, writing essays and answering complex philosophical questions. These cells were often uncomfortable, cramped, and poorly lit, offering no privacy or convenience. Yet the sheer prestige of success and the potential for advancement drove hundreds of thousands to participate. The competition was fierce, with only a minute fraction achieving success. The vast majority failed, many repeatedly, but some persisted for decades, retaking the exams well into middle age in hopes of finally earning the coveted title that could change their family's fortunes. Despite its promise of meritocracy, the imperial examination system was not entirely free from criticism or limitation. Access to quality education was still largely influenced by wealth and geographic location, with urban and well connected families enjoying greater advantages than rural or impoverished households. Furthermore, the heavy focus on rote memorization and adherence to rigid interpretive frameworks sometimes stifled creativity and discouraged critical thinking. Over time, this created a class of officials who were experts in the Confucian canon, but less equipped to deal with practical governance challenges, innovation, or the evolving needs of a changing society. Nevertheless, the moral ideal embedded in the system, that those who govern must be learned, virtuous, and tested, remained a powerful and stabilizing concept throughout Chinese history. The system also had significant political implications. It allowed emperors to maintain tighter control over appointments and reduced reliance on aristocratic families who might otherwise become centers of independent power. By recruiting officials who owed their positions not to family connections, but to state sponsored assessments, emperors reinforced the idea of loyalty to the throne. These bureaucrats, having invested so much in passing the exams, often became some of the most devoted servants of the state, upholding its ideology with diligence and pride. This contributed to a relatively stable administrative structure that could withstand dynastic changes, rebellions, and even foreign invasions. In cultural terms, the examination system also helped standardize and perpetuate a shared intellectual heritage across the vast empire. Whether in the mountains of Sichuan or the coastal cities of Fujian, candidates studied the same texts, used the same calligraphic styles, and referenced the same historical examples. This not only reinforced a unified identity among the elite, but also played a role in the long-term continuity of Chinese civilization. Education became the ultimate path to personal betterment, and Confucian values were deeply embedded in both public and private life, influencing everything from familial structures to moral expectations. In the later centuries, especially during the Ming and Qing dynasties, the examination system became even more deeply entrenched, with entire publishing industries dedicated to producing study guides, model essays, and commentaries on the classics. Temples were built to honor Confucius, and scholars who passed the exams were celebrated with public ceremonies and ancestral recognition. The examination halls grew larger, accommodating tens of thousands of candidates in major cities. These events became social spectacles, with families and communities rallying around the young men who dared to undertake the arduous challenge. It was not only a personal pursuit, but a communal hope, reflecting the intense social investment in intellectual achievement. However, by the 19th century, cracks in the system began to show more clearly. As foreign powers encroached on China and internal rebellions threatened the Qing dynasty, it became apparent that the bureaucratic elite produced by the examination system lacked the necessary tools to modernize the country. Their training in ancient texts did little to prepare them for diplomacy, technological innovation, or military reform. The rigidity of the system, once its strength, had become a liability. Calls for reform grew louder, and eventually, in the early 20th century, the imperial examination system was abolished altogether as part of sweeping modernization efforts. Its end marked the close of a defining chapter in Chinese history, but its legacy continued to echo in the value placed on education, the reverence for scholars, and the enduring influence of Confucian ethics. Even outside of China, the imperial examination system left a lasting mark. Observers from other countries marveled at a government where advancement was determined, at least in theory, by knowledge rather than birth. In particular, 19th century Western intellectuals and reformers took interest in the idea, and it inspired elements of the modern civil service examinations that now exist in many countries. The notion that a society should reward talent, discipline, and learning rather than privilege continues to resonate globally. And in this sense, the imperial examinations were not just a Chinese institution, but a gift to the broader human endeavor toward just and capable governance. The power of the imperial examination system lay not merely in its function as a recruitment tool, but in the ideals it represented. It was a grand social experiment, one that reshaped the trajectory of Chinese civilization and influenced models of bureaucracy around the world. It held up the scholar as a moral exemplar, placed learning above lineage, and encouraged generations to seek their future through the pursuit of wisdom. Though it had its flaws and eventually outlived its usefulness, its core principle that leadership must be earned through merit remains as relevant today as it was in the imperial courts of ancient China. Diplomatic innovation also became a hallmark of Han foreign policy. Rather than demanding submission, envoys were sent bearing lavish gifts and letters of friendship, setting a tone of mutual respect. Han officials understood that securing influence through prestige and trust could often yield better results than warfare. Some emissaries remained in foreign courts for years, acting as cultural translators and informal advisors. These roles cemented China's reputation as a stable and sophisticated power, capable of building lasting bridges rather than temporary alliances. The economic mechanics of Silk Road trade were complex and involved a vast network of middlemen. Han China's silk rarely traveled all the way to Rome in the hands of a single merchant. Instead, it passed through a chain of traders, each adding value and taking a share of profit. This decentralized system was remarkably efficient and allowed for constant adaptation. Markets in Kashgar might trade the silk for lapis lazuli, which would then move west, exchange for spices that found their way back east. This intricate web of barter and sale was held together not by a single empire, but by mutual need and shared trust in the value of goods. Over time, the Silk Road came to influence how the Han viewed the concept of empire itself. No longer was the empire seen merely as unified territory bordered by mountains and rivers. It became a network of influence radiating outward, defined by the reach of Chinese goods, ideas, and prestige. This evolution of thought led to a reimagining of Chinese superiority, not as isolation, but as centrality in a world of exchange. The term Middle Kingdom took on new meaning, not just geographically, but as a cultural and economic crossroads between East and West. Even after the eventual decline of the Western Han dynasty, the momentum created by centuries of Silk Road engagement did not vanish. Later dynasties would revive and expand these trade routes, building on the structures and relationships established by the Han. The notion that China could shape global discourse through cultural strength rather than military might became a guiding philosophy for centuries. The Han's legacy was not just a golden age at home, but a blueprint for global engagement that echoed through history. The environmental implications of Silk Road activity were also notable. As trade intensified, previously untouched regions saw the rise of settlements, farms, and trade posts. This had ecological consequences. Forests were cleared for agriculture, water systems were altered to sustain caravan stops, and new animal species were introduced across biomes. These shifts, while gradual, contributed to the development of a more interconnected natural world, where plants and animals, like people, crossed borders and adapted to new environments. Lastly, it's crucial to acknowledge that the Silk Road was not merely an achievement of statesmen and emperors. It was built on the labor and courage of ordinary individuals. Caravanners, interpreters, craftspeople, and camel tenders faced searing heat, howling blizzards, and constant danger. Yet they pressed on, motivated by hope, necessity, and curiosity. It is their unseen toil that made the grand vision of Han China's global reach possible. Their footsteps, worn into desert trails and mountain paths, are the real legacy of the Silk Road, a testament to the quiet, determined pursuit of connection. In the grand sweep of history, the Silk Road stands not just as a marvel of ancient logistics or economic exchange, but as a symbol of what civilizations can achieve when they dare to look beyond themselves. Han China, through vision and resilience, laid the foundations for a connected world long before globalization became a modern ideal. Its global reach was not imposed. It was invited, built through trust, shared values, and the timeless desire to know what lies beyond the horizon. Women in ancient China, between power and silence. Women in ancient China lived within a tightly woven web of tradition, expectation, and cultural norms that both limited and defined their lives. Their existence, though often cast in the shadows of history, was deeply significant and layered with quiet strength. While Confucian doctrines emphasized obedience and domesticity, this did not mean that women had no role or influence. In fact, the world they inhabited was rich with ritual, responsibility, and at times subtle forms of power that were exercised behind closed doors. From imperial courts to village homes, women navigated a social landscape marked by patriarchy, where silence was often a necessity, but not always a surrender. The foundation of a woman's life in ancient China began with her birth, an event that was not always celebrated. Sons were favored as carriers of the family name and future caretakers of the ancestors. Daughters, by contrast, were often seen as temporary members of their natal households, expected to leave one day and join another family through marriage. Despite this, the early years of a girl's life were filled with teachings in discipline, virtue, and propriety. Mothers and grandmothers became the first teachers, passing down the essential skills for managing a household: spinning, weaving, cooking, and overseeing domestic affairs. Education, when permitted, focused primarily on moral behavior and the duties of a good wife and mother. Marriage marked a profound transformation. A young woman, often still in her teens, would leave her home and become part of her husband's family. This transition was not simply a change in residence, it was a shift in identity. A bride would now be under the authority of her mother-in-law, tasked with earning her place through humility, hard work, and the production of male heirs. The Confucian hierarchy that governed family life placed women in a subordinate position, emphasizing the virtue of obedience to fathers, husbands, and eventually sons. Yet within this structure, women found ways to assert themselves, not through defiance, but through quiet resilience and strategic influence. In some households, especially those of the elite, women wielded a kind of informal power. A mother-in-law who had borne sons and earned respect could become the central figure in domestic decisions. Her influence extended over finances, marriage arrangements, and the internal harmony of the family. This authority was rarely documented or praised in historical texts, but it was nonetheless vital. Moreover, the concept of filial piety applied to all members of the family, and a woman who had fulfilled her duties faithfully could command considerable deference from younger generations. Imperial China also saw remarkable exceptions, women who rose to visible and extraordinary prominence. While rare, female sovereigns, empresses, and consorts occasionally wielded power that rivaled or even surpassed that of men. The most well-known example is Empress Wu Zetian of the Tang Dynasty, who declared herself emperor and ruled with intelligence, ambition, and ruthlessness. Her reign, though controversial, is a testament to the fact that the structures of patriarchy could be bent under the right conditions. Even women who did not sit on thrones could play pivotal roles in court politics, using marriage alliances, palace intrigue, and maternal influence to steer the course of dynasties. Literary and artistic expressions offer another window into the lives of women. Female poets and writers, though often confined by limited access to education, managed to leave their mark. Their verses spoke of love, longing, isolation, and strength. The act of writing was itself a form of resistance, a quiet voice in a world that prized silence. Paintings and embroidery, too, became mediums through which women could express their inner worlds. These creative outlets were often shared within families or between female friends, forming bonds of solidarity in a male-dominated society. Religion and spirituality also played roles in shaping women's experiences. Taoism, for example, offered more spiritual equality than Confucianism. Some women became Taoist nuns, dedicating their lives to meditation, healing, and the pursuit of inner harmony. In Buddhist temples, women could seek refuge from oppressive marriages or widowhood, and some even rose to positions of leadership within the monastic community. These spiritual paths, though not available to all, offered an alternative to the rigid roles assigned by society. Widowhood, while often a source of hardship, also opened unexpected possibilities. A widow who chose not to remarry, a practice praised by Confucian moralists, could gain a measure of autonomy. She might become the head of the household, managing property, raising children, and overseeing family rituals. This respect, however, came at a cost. Remarrying was often stigmatized, and widows were expected to live lives of chastity and devotion to their deceased husbands. In this way, loyalty was demanded even beyond the grave, reinforcing the control of male authority across time. While the upper classes had some access to influence and education, peasant women lived lives shaped more by the rhythms of labor and survival. In agricultural communities, women worked alongside men in the fields, managed food storage, and oversaw the spinning and weaving of cloth. Their contribution was essential to the family's livelihood, yet they remained largely invisible in official records. Despite their labor, their status was no higher than their husbands, and they remained under the same social expectations of obedience and subservience. Childbearing was both a blessing and a burden. A woman's value often rested on her ability to produce sons who would carry on the family name and ensure the continuation of ancestor worship. The birth of a boy brought joy and honor, while the birth of a girl might elicit disappointment or even neglect. This pressure could create intense emotional and physical strain. The danger of childbirth, coupled with the high expectations of motherhood, made women's health precarious. Yet through it all, mothers often became the emotional core of the family, nurturing future generations and preserving traditions through lullabies, stories, and rituals. With the rise of the Sui and Tang dynasties, China's confidence on the global stage increased. The Tang, in particular, expanded China's borders significantly, pushing into Central Asia and maintaining a powerful cavalry force. During their rule, the concept of using large walls diminished somewhat in importance. The Tang relied more on mobile armies and alliances than on static defenses. Nonetheless, remnants of earlier walls were repaired or adapted for new purposes, such as marking administrative boundaries or housing outposts. The walls remained part of the landscape and memory of northern China, even if their strategic role had evolved. Later dynasties, such as the Song and Liao, also made use of regional walls, although their emphasis was more on diplomacy and tribute systems to manage threats. It was not until the Mongol invasions and the eventual rise of the Ming dynasty that large-scale wall construction returned with renewed vigor. But by then, the idea of the wall had already been deeply embedded into China's strategic thinking. The Ming would build what is now the most visible and well-preserved sections of the Great Wall, but they were building upon a foundation that had been laid centuries earlier. Their walls were higher, stronger, and more permanent, using brick and stone extensively. But in essence, they were reviving and amplifying the long tradition of wall building that stretched back to the earliest days of Chinese statehood. The historical significance of these pre-Great Wall structures is immense. They show how Chinese civilizations responded to the geographical and political challenges of their time with pragmatic and large-scale engineering. The early walls were not just military tools. They were also symbols of a state's ability to control its territory, project power, and manage complex societies. They reveal how ancient China was never a monolith, but a patchwork of competing powers, each developing unique approaches to defense and control. The cumulative knowledge gained through centuries of building, adapting, and experimenting with wall systems laid the groundwork for one of the world's most iconic monuments. Moreover, these early fortifications shaped how later Chinese dynasties viewed their borders and their enemies. The walls created both real and imagined boundaries, dividing civilization from wilderness, order from chaos, insiders from outsiders. They were as much psychological tools as they were physical ones. The persistence of wall building across dynasties suggests a deep-seated belief in the effectiveness of such barriers, not just for defense, but for maintaining a sense of cultural identity and historical continuity. In the modern era, much attention has been given to the grandeur of the Ming Great Wall. But to fully understand its origins, one must look deeper into the fragmented centuries that preceded it, when states built walls not for show, but for survival. These early constructions were modest in appearance, but monumental in influence. They were the proving ground for ideas, methods, and materials that would later culminate in the most famous wall of all. The Great Wall, then, is not a beginning, but a culmination, a visible peak rising from layers of forgotten foundations, each laid by those who came before in pursuit of security, unity, and legacy. The legalist legacy: control, order, and fear. The legacy of legalism in ancient China casts a long, often grim shadow across the landscape of governance and law. Emerging during the tumultuous Warring States period, legalism arose as a response to chaos, instability, and the perceived inadequacy of moral philosophies like Confucianism and Taoism. Its architects believed that human nature was inherently selfish and short-sighted, and thus only through strict laws, harsh punishments, and centralized control could order be restored and society function. Unlike the soft appeals to virtue or harmony found in rival schools of thought, legalism was unapologetically pragmatic, often ruthless and deeply authoritarian. Its impact was not only theoretical but material and far-reaching, shaping the very foundations of imperial governance, most notably under the Qin dynasty, and leaving a blueprint for control that would echo through Chinese history. Legalist thought was not the product of a single philosopher, but rather a convergence of several intellectual voices, with Xiangyang, Han Feizi, and Li Si being the most prominent. Each contributed to a doctrine that championed the supremacy of law over tradition and the authority of the ruler over all other considerations. Xiangyang, in particular, implemented these ideas with brutal efficiency in the state of Qin. He reorganized society to prioritize agriculture and warfare, rewarded loyalty to the state over family ties, and imposed laws so severe that they created a culture of obedience through fear. To Xiangyang and his successors, leniency was weakness, and moral persuasion was ineffectual in governing the masses. Their vision was one of a perfectly ordered society in which every person knew their role, followed the rules, and feared the consequences of deviation. When Qin Shi Huang unified China in 221 BCE, it was legalism that underpinned the machinery of his empire. The emperor, advised by legalist thinkers like Li Si, centralized authority to an unprecedented degree, abolishing feudal fiefdoms and replacing them with bureaucratic districts directly controlled by the state. Standardized laws, measurements, currencies, and even scripts were imposed to ensure uniformity and eliminate regional differences. Dissent was crushed, and entire schools of thought, particularly Confucianism, were suppressed through book burnings and executions. This aggressive consolidation of power created a sense of unity and efficiency never before seen in China, but it also bred resentment, fear, and a fragile peace maintained through constant surveillance and punishment. Legalist principles extended into the minutiae of daily life. The law was not meant to be interpreted through human judgment or ethics. It was meant to be followed without question. The idea that laws should be blind to status or intent was, on one hand, a step toward equality, but on the other, it often resulted in disproportionate penalties and a culture where self-preservation took precedence over moral action. Spies were encouraged to report on neighbors, family members could be punished for each other's crimes, and rewards for informants made suspicion a civic duty. This systemic mistrust corroded social bonds and transformed communities into networks of mutual fear. The legacy of legalism did not end with the fall of the Qin. Although the dynasty collapsed within a short span due to widespread discontent, many of its administrative innovations endured. The succeeding Han dynasty publicly distanced itself from legalism, favoring Confucian ideals of virtue and filial piety, yet in practice, it retained much of the legalist system of governance. Bureaucracy, centralized power, codified laws, and standardized administration remained hallmarks of Chinese imperial rule. What changed was the outward justification. The harsh methods persisted, but they were cloaked in the language of moral duty rather than brute necessity. This synthesis of Confucian ethics and legalist practicality would come to define the imperial Chinese state for centuries. Legalism's durability lies in its clear, functional appeal to rulers who valued stability above all else. Its promise of control through regulation and its emphasis on efficiency over emotion made it especially attractive in times of crisis. Even though later dynasties officially rejected its doctrine, legalist strategies were often revived when power was threatened. During times of rebellion or external invasion, rulers reverted to stricter laws, harsher penalties, and more centralized authority, echoing the foundational principles of legalism. The very idea that the health of the state outweighed the rights or comforts of the individual became a recurring theme in Chinese governance. What makes legalism particularly distinct is its relationship with fear. While most philosophies in the ancient world aimed to inspire, elevate, or console, legalism weaponized fear as a tool of statecraft. Fear of punishment replaced internal conscience as the motivator for behavior. Legalists argued that fear was more reliable than virtue because it could be measured and enforced. This belief created systems where compliance was more important than understanding, and where silence was safer than expression. It discouraged rebellion, yes, but it also stifled innovation, dissent, and reform. The Qin example demonstrated both the strengths and fatal weaknesses of legalist rule. On one hand, it showed how rapidly a disorganized region could be unified and transformed into an empire through strict discipline and central planning. On the other, it exposed the dangers of ruling through intimidation. The empire fell apart soon after the death of Qin Shi Huang, a testament to how brittle a system becomes when held together solely by force. People may follow rules when afraid, but fear alone does not breed loyalty or resilience. The very mechanisms that enabled rapid expansion were the same that accelerated the collapse once the central figure was gone: music, ritual, and harmony in Confucian thought. In the tapestry of ancient Chinese philosophy, few elements wove together the societal, spiritual, and ethical threads of life as seamlessly as music and ritual in the Confucian tradition. Confucius, the sage whose teachings would echo through the centuries, regarded these two domains not merely as aesthetic or ceremonial endeavors, but as essential instruments in cultivating a well-ordered society. For Confucius, music and ritual were not secondary to governance or moral instruction. They were its very soul. Harmony, a concept central to Confucianism, was thought to emerge not only from political stability or social hierarchy, but from the resonance of ritual propriety and the rhythms of music echoing through the individual and the collective. These practices were more than outward acts. They were disciplines of inner refinement, shaping character, aligning emotion with principle, and binding communities through shared tradition. Confucian thought developed in an age when the Zhou dynasty's legacy was still deeply embedded in the cultural psyche. The earlier Zhou kings had already emphasized the use of music and ritual to uphold cosmic order, and Confucius inherited and expanded this idea. He saw in the ceremonial rites of the past a blueprint for societal health, a way to reconnect human action with a greater moral order. Music and ritual, in his vision, were two halves of the same guiding force, one channeling the emotional and spiritual life of individuals, the other structuring that life through codified behavior. Rituals offered clarity to relationships between ruler and subject, parent and child, friend and friend, while music expressed the sentiments these roles ideally engendered. Together, they helped maintain the social fabric by transforming emotion into conduct and conduct into harmony. In Confucianism, rituals were not seen as hollow performances, but as deeply meaningful acts that cultivated virtue through repetition and respect. Whether it was the way one bowed, served tea, or mourned the dead, every gesture held ethical weight. These actions trained individuals to subordinate personal whims to a greater communal order. They instilled reverence, patience, and a sense of belonging. Importantly, Confucius believed that by participating in rituals, individuals absorbed the values embedded in them, not through force or fear, but through grace and familiarity. A well-performed rite did not merely show respect, it embodied it. This distinction lies at the heart of Confucian ethical cultivation. Morality was not imposed from above, but grown from within, nurtured by constant engagement with meaningful traditions. If ritual was the structure, then music was the spirit that animated it. Confucius had a profound appreciation for the transformative power of music. He believed it could elevate the soul, align the mind with the heart, and draw people together in subtle unity. Music had a moral dimension. It could either refine or corrupt, depending on its character. Confucius preferred music that was orderly, gentle, and noble. He criticized tunes that were overly stimulating or disordered, believing that such styles encouraged chaos in thought and behavior. Thus, music was not a neutral art form. It carried ethical consequences. The melodies of a people reflected their values, and to hear the music of a time was, for Confucius, to understand its virtue or its decline. Within this framework, harmony was more than a sonic quality. It was a social and moral one. Harmony did not mean sameness or the absence of tension, but a dynamic balance between differing elements. Just as musical instruments each have their unique voice, so too did individuals play distinct roles in society. The goal was not to erase difference, but to orchestrate it. Harmony required coordination, mutual responsiveness, and an ear tuned to the needs of the moment. In this sense, both music and ritual became metaphors for ideal governance. A good ruler, like a skilled conductor, did not dominate but guided each element to play its part at the right time and in the right way. Authority was not coercion, but coordination, a skillful blending of roles to produce collective resonance. Confucius often used music as a diagnostic tool to assess personal and political well being. A person who delighted in refined music was thought to be morally inclined, while those drawn to excessive noise or indulgent rhythms were believed to be out of balance. The state, too, could be judged by its musical inclinations. A kingdom filled with harmonious, modest melodies was likely to be governed with justice and wisdom. By contrast, a realm obsessed with extravagant spectacles and unregulated performances revealed a breakdown in moral order. Music thus became a mirror of the soul, both individual and collective, revealing hidden truths that words could obscure. In teaching music, Confucius was not merely cultivating artistic skill, he was shaping hearts and tempering ambitions. The connection between music and education was another cornerstone of Confucian thought. Confucius believed that young minds should be trained not only in reading and governance, but in aesthetic sensibility. Music was part of the traditional 6 arts alongside rites, archery, charioteering, calligraphy, and mathematics. This comprehensive education aimed to produce not mere bureaucrats or warriors, but well-rounded human beings. Music, in particular, taught rhythm, moderation, and emotional awareness, qualities essential for leadership and empathy. It was not about performance or entertainment, but about self-discipline and connection. Confucius himself was known to be moved to tears by certain ancient compositions, attesting to music's ability to reach the depths of the human spirit. Ritual, too, was inseparable from the educational project. Children were taught how to bow, how to address elders, how to express grief and gratitude, all through ritualized behavior. These were not empty customs, they were scripts that conveyed values across generations. Even the simplest rites, such as lighting incense or offering food to ancestors, carried lessons about respect, continuity, and humility. The repetitive nature of ritual was not a flaw, but a feature. It embedded patterns into the mind, training reflexes toward moral behavior. Confucianism held that when such habits were fully internalized, virtue would flow effortlessly. People would not have to deliberate about doing the right thing. It would come naturally, like a well-rehearsed melody or a familiar gesture of reverence. Moreover, music and ritual had an equalizing effect. They provided a common language for society, transcending differences of wealth, status, and region. In participating in the same rites and hearing the same music, people experienced a sense of unity that surpassed verbal agreement or legal contract. This was especially important in a vast and diverse empire like ancient China, where different dialects, customs, and backgrounds could easily lead to fragmentation. Confucian rituals, standardized yet meaningful, offered a form of cultural cohesion. Music, too, became a bridge across these divides, an emotional current running through the heart of a civilization. The deep integration of these practices into governance further reveals their importance. Confucian advisors often urged rulers to maintain ceremonial music and state rituals, not for spectacle, but as tools of moral leadership. A ruler who observed the ancestral rites with sincerity, who attended musical performances with discernment, was seen as governing through virtue rather than force. The rites performed at ancestral temples, the music played at court, these were not distractions from politics, but expressions of it. They reminded all present of continuity, hierarchy, and shared purpose. Through ritual, the ruler acknowledged his role as custodian of the past. Through music, he attuned his court to the rhythms of ethical governance. Even in times of crisis, Confucius urged a return to ritual and music as stabilizing forces. When the world seemed fragmented, when rulers lost their way or subjects grew discontent, the answer was not rebellion, but restoration, bringing back the rhythms and rites that once held things together. This perspective viewed disorder not as a breakdown of laws alone, but as a failure of moral cultivation. Just as a dissonant note unsettles a melody, an act lacking in ritual propriety could unsettle an entire community. Confucius did not call for innovation in such times, but for memory, to remember the power of tradition to bind, calm, and uplift. This reverence for tradition, however, did not mean rigidity. Confucius understood that rites had to be performed with sincerity, not slavish imitation. He often criticized rote behavior that lacked feeling. A bow given with resentment or a song played without attentiveness missed the point entirely. What mattered was not the form alone, but the spirit animating it. Thus, Confucian ritualism was not mechanical, it was expressive, grounded in authenticity. Music, too, had to be felt, not just played. A performance devoid of emotion could not foster harmony. The ultimate goal was to bring heart and action into unity, to ensure that outer behavior reflected inner alignment. In Confucian thought, then, music and ritual were not simply instruments of control or markers of status. They were profound tools for moral development and social integration. They offered a way to shape the emotions, refine the mind, and stabilize the world. Through their disciplined beauty, they expressed the central Confucian ideal, that harmony arises when each part of the whole plays its proper role with sincerity and care. Just as a well-composed symphony does not silence its instruments but guides them into a shared rhythm, so too did Confucius envision a society where order did not suppress but harmonized, where governance was not domination but orchestration, and where the path to virtue was paved with the quiet power of tradition. Astrology, calendars, and imperial power. In the ancient world, the sky was more than a backdrop to daily life. It was a canvas of meaning, a divine script that rulers, priests, and scholars read to understand the world and secure authority. In imperial China, the link between astrology, calendrical systems, and political power was more than symbolic. It was a deeply embedded institution that governed the rhythms of state, society, and even the personal fate of the emperor himself. The heavens were seen as a mirror of the earthly order, and any disturbance in the sky, a comet, eclipse, or unusual planetary alignment, was interpreted as a sign of cosmic imbalance. Such signs could signal the favor or disapproval of heaven, the ultimate force believed to grant or revoke the mandate of heaven from a ruling dynasty. Thus, maintaining harmony between heaven and earth became a political necessity, and astrology was not mere superstition, but a tool of governance. From early times, rulers employed astrologers and calendar experts within the court bureaucracy. These individuals were highly trained and held positions of immense responsibility. Their interpretations influenced major state decisions, from the scheduling of military campaigns and harvest festivals to imperial coronations and sacrificial rites. The calendar was not just a way to mark time, but a declaration of sovereignty. To issue a calendar was to affirm one's right to rule. It symbolized the emperor's role as the intermediary between heaven and earth. Only a legitimate ruler could produce the correct calendar, and doing so was seen as a demonstration of moral order and cosmic alignment. China's calendar system was rooted in both lunar and solar observations, blending practical agricultural needs with cosmological significance. The lunisolar calendar tracked the moon's cycles while aligning them with solar terms to ensure seasonal accuracy for farming. This synchronization was complex and required constant refinement. The Bureau of Astronomy, an official institution under the imperial government, was tasked with maintaining this delicate balance. These astronomers had to be both mathematicians and diviners, adjusting months, adding leap months, and ensuring that ritual ceremonies were conducted at the most auspicious times. An error in calculation was not merely a technical issue, it could be viewed as an omen of dynastic decline or misrule. Astrological beliefs were intimately tied to the legitimacy of dynasties. When natural disasters struck or celestial irregularities occurred, critics could interpret them as signs that the emperor had lost heaven's favor. In times of famine, earthquake, or plague, public pressure would grow for the ruler to acknowledge heaven's displeasure. Often emperors would respond with acts of contrition, such as issuing proclamations of self-criticism, reducing taxes, or conducting elaborate rituals of repentance. These gestures were not simply political optics, but part of a sacred exchange between ruler and cosmos. The emperor, known as the Son of Heaven, was not above the system, he was bound by it. Failure to respond appropriately could erode imperial authority and even invite rebellion, as rivals could claim that the mandate had passed to them. Throughout various dynasties, the relationship between astrology and rule evolved, but never disappeared. During the Han Dynasty, for instance, court astrologers played crucial roles in interpreting omens. The Han rulers blended earlier Zhou traditions with emerging Confucian ideas, reinforcing the notion that moral governance was linked to cosmic order. If the ruler failed in his virtue, the heavens would respond accordingly. Later dynasties, such as the Tang and Song, advanced astronomical technologies, building observatories and refining instruments to chart the stars with greater precision. These developments were not merely scientific, they were deeply political. Better celestial data meant more accurate calendars, which meant a more stable claim to heaven's mandate. Astrological forecasting also influenced imperial succession. When signs in the heavens suggested instability, the court might interpret these as a need for change within the palace. At times, this led to early abdications, regency arrangements, or power shifts among factions. The celestial sphere thus had a quiet but potent influence on palace politics. Empresses, eunuchs, and advisors often sought the favor of court astrologers, hoping to shape narratives about destiny and fate that could sway decisions at the highest levels. Astrology became a language of power, and those who could speak it fluently held sway over more than just charts. They could alter the fate of empires. Calendar reforms were moments of both technical refinement and political transformation. A new dynasty often introduced a revised calendar as one of its first acts. This was more than a logistical necessity. It was a cosmic declaration that a new order had begun. For example, the Ming Dynasty launched its reign with significant adjustments to the calendar system, seeking to distance itself from Mongol rule and affirm a return to traditional Han values. The Qing Dynasty, though ethnically Manchu, maintained and expanded the imperial calendar system to legitimize their reign over Han subjects. They preserved the Bureau of Astronomy and even employed Jesuit missionaries who brought Western astronomical knowledge to the imperial court. These collaborations were permitted because they enhanced the precision of celestial predictions, reinforcing the emperor's claim to divine favor through scientific accuracy. The role of astrology also extended to foreign policy. Envoys and tributary states often synchronized their ceremonial visits with celestial events deemed auspicious. The imperial court used these occasions to stage grand rituals, aligning the affairs of earth with those of heaven in a performance of universal harmony. In turn, the presentation of astronomical knowledge and calendars to foreign powers served as a symbol of cultural and civilizational superiority. The Chinese emperor was presented as the axis around which the world revolved, a center of not just terrestrial but celestial order. Even internal uprisings and peasant movements often borrowed the language of astrology to justify rebellion. Prophetic visions, stars aligning, or comets blazing across the sky could serve as calls to action. Rebel leaders would claim they were guided by heaven, that the time had come for the current dynasty to fall. Such movements were not purely military. They were cosmological assertions that the world's order had shifted. The Yellow Turban Rebellion of the late Han era is a prime example. Its leaders used astrology and mysticism to galvanize the populace, invoking cosmic cycles as proof that a new age was dawning. The imperial calendar, therefore, was more than a schedule. It was a cosmic script. Festivals, mourning periods, examinations, and even executions were timed according to celestial readings. This structuring of time reinforced hierarchy and harmony, key values in the Confucian political worldview. Everyone, from the emperor to the lowest peasant, lived within the rhythms dictated by heaven, as interpreted by the state. The calendar reached into every part of life, making the unseen hand of the cosmos a felt presence in daily affairs. The symbolic alignment between timekeeping and rulership also appeared in literature and art. Court poets often referred to heavenly omens, using celestial metaphors to praise or criticize political figures. Painters depicted emperors seated beneath starry skies, flanked by symbols of astrological power, dragons, phoenixes, and constellations. Architecture, too, reflected these alignments. Palaces, altars, and city plans were often designed to mirror cosmological principles, reinforcing the idea that the emperor ruled not arbitrarily, but in accordance with a greater cosmic pattern. Over centuries, the technologies and theories of astronomy would evolve, and modern science would eventually distance itself from astrology. But in the time of emperors, there was no clear separation. The science of the stars and the rituals of power were woven together into a single fabric. To govern time was to govern the world. The sky was not a neutral space, but a living, reactive entity. It offered messages to those wise enough to read them and warnings to those foolish enough to ignore them. In essence, astrology and calendars in imperial China were not passive traditions, but active instruments of power. They provided a means to align human authority with divine will, offering emperors a tool to solidify their rule and a warning system for when that rule strayed from virtue. The stars, it was believed, did not lie. They bore witness to the rise and fall of dynasties, and their silent movements wrote the fate of nations. In every eclipse, every solstice, every meticulously calculated festival, the celestial sphere whispered the story of the empire, reminding rulers that their power was never absolute. It was borrowed from heaven and always subject to return. The Dragon Throne, symbols of absolute rule. The Dragon Throne of Imperial China stands as one of the most enduring symbols of absolute authority in human history. For over 2 millennia, it represented the celestial mandate granted to emperors, a divine seal of legitimacy that elevated a single man above all others within the vast and complex realm of the Chinese Empire. More than a mere seat of power, the Dragon Throne embodied an ideology, a belief system rooted in Confucian principles, cosmological order, and political necessity. It was not simply a physical structure, but a conceptual embodiment of sovereignty. Its ornate carvings and imperial dragons whispered of divine lineage, ancient rights, and the burden of rule. From the Qin dynasty to the fall of the Qing, the throne served as both the literal and symbolic center of authority, and every emperor who ascended it became the living representative of heaven's will on earth. In imperial China, the dragon was not just a mythological creature, but an emblem of ultimate power, chosen to distinguish the emperor from all others. Unlike the Western conception of dragons as destructive beasts, the Chinese dragon was a benevolent and potent force, associated with rain, fertility, wisdom, and the cosmic balance. It is for this reason that the emperors of China adopted it as their exclusive totem, decorating their robes, banners, and palaces with its image. The dragon on the throne, often with 5 claws, reserved solely for the emperor, signified unmatched supremacy, indicating that the occupant was not merely a man, but a mediator between heaven and earth. The throne's symbolism was thus both mystical and practical, reaffirming the emperor's right to rule while also embedding his legitimacy in the cosmic order. The architecture of the Forbidden City, where the dragon throne was enshrined, was constructed to reinforce this cosmic narrative. The throne sat in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, elevated and centrally aligned within a meticulously planned compound that reflected the traditional Chinese worldview. The spatial layout adhered to strict principles of geomancy and symmetry, with the emperor's seat positioned to mirror the axis of the cosmos. Every brick, column, and tile echoed this theme of celestial authority, and approaching the throne meant entering the spiritual heart of the empire. The vast courtyards, imposing gates, and ritualistic procession routes were designed to instill awe and underscore the emperor's separation from the mundane world. To stand before the throne was not merely to meet a ruler, but to be in the presence of a divine institution. This ideology of absolute rule was supported by a vast bureaucratic system rooted in Confucian ideals. While the emperor was revered as the son of heaven, he was also expected to embody moral virtue and maintain harmony within the realm. The dragon throne came with the weight of responsibility, not only to govern effectively, but to uphold the moral order of the world. The emperor's conduct was believed to influence natural events. Droughts, floods, and earthquakes were often interpreted as signs of his moral failings. Thus, ruling from the dragon throne meant more than issuing decrees. It required personal integrity and constant self-cultivation. The throne was not merely a reward for power, it was a test of character, a position from which failure could bring not only political downfall, but cosmic disorder. Ritual played a crucial role in reinforcing the throne's authority. Elaborate ceremonies marked imperial birthdays, enthronements, sacrifices, and seasonal observances, each carefully orchestrated to affirm the emperor's divine mandate. The throne served as the focal point of these events, often hidden behind ceremonial screens or unveiled in solemn processions. Even the emperor's appearances before his court were deeply ritualized. Ministers would bow in unison, speaking in formal tones, never turning their backs as they exited the hall. This culture of ritual not only magnified the emperor's mystique, but also reinforced a rigid hierarchy, with the dragon throne as its unassailable pinnacle. These traditions were not merely symbolic, but served to perpetuate a political structure in which the emperor's word was law, and his presence, though rare, was akin to that of a sacred being. Throughout Chinese history, the legitimacy of a ruler often hinged on control of the dragon throne. Dynastic transitions were justified through the concept of the mandate of heaven, a doctrine which allowed for rebellion if an emperor was deemed unworthy. Yet even usurpers and rebels, once in power, would seek to cloak themselves in the symbolism of the throne, thereby affirming their rule in traditional terms. The throne itself, once seized, became a powerful legitimizing tool. Its very symbolism compelled adherence to a familiar political and cultural framework. No matter how dramatic the upheaval, the structure remained. The new emperor would take the same seat, observe the same rituals, and proclaim his mandate from the same elevated platform. In this way, the dragon throne provided a strange continuity through centuries of change, binding disparate reigns under a common celestial logic. Materially, the throne was a marvel of craftsmanship, often carved from rare woods and inlaid with precious metals, jade, and lacquer. Dragons coiled around its arms and legs, their sinuous bodies exuding movement and vitality. The seat was elevated, sometimes with steps symbolizing the stages of ascent from the human to the divine. Behind it, immense screens painted with phoenixes or mountains reinforced themes of harmony and immortality. The dragon motifs were not merely decorative, but intentionally placed to project majesty and spiritual gravitas. Surrounding the throne were objects of ritual significance: incense burners shaped like mythical beasts, ceremonial tablets, and imperial seals, each contributing to the throne's aura of sacred authority. This aesthetic cohesion was not accidental. It was designed to create an immersive environment in which the emperor appeared larger than life, encircled by the very symbols that justified his reign. The throne's role was not limited to the internal workings of the court. It also projected China's power to the outside world. Tributary states that came to the Forbidden City performed ritual obeisance before the dragon throne, offering exotic gifts and affirming the supremacy of the Chinese emperor. This was not merely diplomatic theater, but a demonstration of the cosmic order in which China occupied the central and highest position. The throne thus served as a geopolitical instrument, reinforcing China's place in the imagined hierarchy of nations. Even foreign envoys, constrained by their own cultural norms, had to navigate this system, often adapting their protocols to satisfy the ritual demands of the imperial court. The dragon throne stood not only for the ruler of a nation, but for the central axis of civilization as envisioned by the Chinese worldview. The fall of the Qing dynasty in the early 20th century marked the end of the dragon throne's political power, but not its symbolic resonance. Even as republican ideals swept across China and modern governance took root, the throne remained a potent image of national heritage. It continued to captivate the public imagination, finding its place in literature, film, and political rhetoric. The Forbidden City, now a museum, draws millions of visitors each year, many of whom gaze upon the empty throne and feel the ghost of imperial majesty lingering in its shadow. The throne has transitioned from a seat of real power to an artifact of cultural memory, yet it retains its ability to inspire awe. It serves as a reminder of a time when a single man was believed to embody the universe's will, and his throne, coiled in dragons and veiled in incense, stood as a beacon of absolute rule. Despite the dynasties that rose and fell, despite warlords and rebellions, despite foreign invasions and internal strife, the idea of the dragon throne endured. It was a symbol resilient enough to transcend individual emperors and strong enough to survive their failures. Its enduring relevance lay in its dual nature, anchored both in the material world of power and the spiritual realm of belief. It was this union of practical governance with sacred ideology that gave the throne its unmatched authority. Emperors might have been flawed, but the throne remained untarnished, a seat waiting for the next chosen one. Even today, its legacy persists, woven into the cultural fabric of a civilization that, though changed, still remembers its celestial kings. The dragon throne is not merely an echo of a bygone era. It is a monument to the profound ways in which symbols can shape history. It teaches us that power is never only about force or law, it is also about perception, ritual, and the capacity to embody ideals greater than oneself. As a vessel for both divine right and mortal responsibility, the throne elevated rulers to the heavens while anchoring them to the people they served. In doing so, it became one of the most powerful symbols of absolute rule the world has ever known. The Terracotta Army, power and death. Buried beneath the earth in silent formation, the Terracotta Army stands as one of the most awe-inspiring testaments to imperial ambition and the belief in power beyond death. Unearthed in 1974 by farmers near Xi'an in Shanxi province, this army of thousands of life-size clay soldiers, horses, and chariots was created to serve China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, in the afterlife. The discovery stunned the world, not just for its artistic magnificence and scale, but for what it revealed about the ideology and psychological landscape of early Chinese imperial rule. Qin Shi Huang, the man who unified China through conquest and iron-willed governance, sought in death the same absolute authority he had wielded in life. This monumental project, concealed underground for over 2 millennia, was not merely a funerary gesture. It was a continuation of statecraft, control, and cosmic legitimacy projected into eternity. The sheer number and complexity of the figures reflect a centralized state with the capacity to command immense resources, labor, and artistic talent. Over 8,000 soldiers, each uniquely modeled with individual facial expressions and detailed armor, suggest a workforce organized with military precision and guided by imperial decree. The figures were arranged in military formation, with officers, infantry, archers, and charioteers, all directed toward a single goal: to protect the emperor in the afterlife from any threat, whether spiritual or imagined. This conceptualization of the afterlife as a realm requiring military defense illustrates how deeply ingrained martial arts were in Qin political thought. Death, rather than serving as the end of authority, was reimagined as a continuation of sovereign responsibility, a realm where control must be exerted and enemies vanquished even beyond the mortal world. The construction of the Terracotta Army cannot be separated from the broader ambitions of Qin Shi Huang. His reign marked the culmination of centuries of warfare among feudal states, and his consolidation of China in 221 BCE was both brutal and revolutionary. In achieving unity, he dismantled aristocratic powers, standardized currency, weights, measures, and even the script. His centralization efforts extended into his mortuary complex, where the creation of a synthetic army was meant to mirror the very real power structure he had enforced across the empire. The mausoleum itself was a microcosm of the state, an underground kingdom populated with bureaucrats, entertainers, acrobats, animals, and warriors. Everything within it served to reproduce the social and political order of his court, ensuring that even in death, Qin Shi Huang remained at the center of a meticulously orchestrated empire. The secrecy surrounding the tomb's construction reveals the paranoia and ambition that accompanied such a grand endeavor. Historical records indicate that thousands of laborers and artisans were conscripted to work on the mausoleum, often for decades. Many of them, according to ancient sources, were buried alive to prevent knowledge of the tomb's exact location from leaking. While the veracity of these claims remains debated, they reflect the immense cost in human lives and labor exacted to maintain the emperor's posthumous authority. This secrecy also speaks to the psychological grip of power, how even the possibility of undermining the emperor's eternal dominion was treated as a threat that needed to be extinguished. The Terracotta Army also offers a window into the technological and artistic sophistication of the Qin state. Each figure was constructed using modular techniques, with torsos, limbs, and heads crafted separately and assembled before being detailed and painted. While the paint has largely faded with time, traces of vibrant colors hint at the once majestic appearance of the figures. The weapons they originally held were real, not symbolic: bronze swords, spears, and crossbows, many of them still sharp and preserved with chromium oxide coating, suggesting advanced metallurgy. These details underscore a culture that saw art not merely as decoration, but as an extension of political and military ideology, a means by which the emperor's power was reinforced and projected, even in death. The decision to craft an army rather than rely on abstract symbolism or mere statuary was significant. In many ancient cultures, rulers were buried with wealth, servants, or carved representations of guardians. The terracotta army, however, goes beyond this by creating an organized, disciplined, and lifelike force capable of responding to threats. This suggests a worldview where the afterlife was not a peaceful reward, but a domain of potential conflict requiring the same vigilance and structure as life. Power, in this vision, was not just a worldly tool, but an eternal condition that had to be defended and enacted perpetually. Furthermore, the site's layout, which includes stables, armories, offices, and even surveillance posts, mimics a real military garrison. This reflects the Qin understanding of empire as a carefully maintained machine that functioned through hierarchy, obedience, and force. The emperor's desire to replicate this in death implies a deep fear of chaos or vulnerability. It reveals a ruler who, despite commanding the largest and most unified state in Chinese history to that point, could not relinquish control, even in death. His immortality was not to be achieved through spiritual transcendence, but through architectural permanence and bureaucratic replication. The construction of the mausoleum also had economic and social implications. The labor required was enormous, likely involving not just state workers, but masses of conscripted peasants. Such projects strained the resources of the empire and may have contributed to unrest that ultimately helped bring down the Qin dynasty shortly after Qin Shi Huang's death. The very monument designed to immortalize his rule thus became a symbol of its fragility. This irony illustrates the paradox at the heart of absolute power, that the attempt to control everything, including the future, can sow the seeds of rapid collapse. While Qin Shi Huang's tomb has yet to be fully excavated, due in part to concerns about preserving its contents and the potential hazards within, legends persist about rivers of mercury and elaborate traps guarding the central chamber. These accounts further enhance the image of a ruler obsessed with control and the fear of disruption. That his actual resting place remains undisturbed aligns poetically with the ethos of his reign, untouchable, unapproachable, and veiled in mystery. Even modern archaeologists tread carefully, respecting not just the technical challenges, but the immense cultural and historical weight the site represents. The terracotta army has also become a powerful symbol in modern times, representing both the grandeur and the limits of authoritarian ambition. It is a reminder that even the most mighty rulers cannot escape death, and yet their influence may echo across time through the institutions, beliefs, and artifacts they leave behind. The soldiers, frozen in mid-step, appear ready to march, not through the afterlife, perhaps, but through the imagination of every generation that rediscovers them. They are not merely guardians of an emperor, but carriers of a story, one that bridges the ancient and the modern, the spiritual and the political. The legacy of the terracotta army lies not only in its historical significance, but in its philosophical implications. It invites reflection on the human desire to transcend mortality through legacy and construction. Qin Shi Huang's obsession with immortality, manifest in alchemical quests, searches for elixirs, and the building of a deathless army, was ultimately unfulfilled in the literal sense. But in creating a structure so grand and mysterious, he inadvertently achieved a different kind of immortality. His name, once buried like the army itself, is now spoken in every corner of the world. His empire fell, but his vision, cast in clay and buried in silence, endured. In the broader scope of Chinese history, the terracotta army marks a beginning as much as an end. It closes the chapter of warring states and opens the narrative of centralized imperial authority, a structure that would shape China for centuries. The figures stand as witnesses to the birth of the Chinese Empire, not as passive relics, but as active expressions of the ideology that forged a civilization. The silence they hold is not empty. It is full of meaning, strategy, fear, and power. To gaze upon them is to confront a ruler's ultimate ambition, to be obeyed not only by the living, but also by the dead. And in this ambition, Qin Shi Huang succeeded, for even today, his army still stands. Alchemy, innovation, and the science of the ancients. Alchemy, that ancient and enigmatic discipline, was once a cornerstone of early scientific thought, bridging the mystical and the empirical. Long before the rigid separation of science and philosophy, alchemy operated in a world where transformation was both a physical and spiritual endeavor. Its roots stretched across civilizations, from Egyptian temples and Babylonian texts to Chinese scrolls and Greco-Roman treatises, forming a sprawling intellectual network that would later shape modern chemistry, metallurgy, and pharmacology. While today it is often dismissed as a relic of superstition, alchemy in its own time was a serious intellectual pursuit, deeply embedded in the broader quest to understand the nature of matter and the hidden mechanisms of the universe. The ancients, who believed that all things could be reduced to a few elemental principles, saw alchemy as the key to unraveling creation itself. The allure of alchemy rested on its promise of transformation. Base metals into gold, sickness into health, mortality into immortality. These were not merely metaphorical ambitions. The ancients sincerely believed that the material world was fluid and mutable, capable of being refined through hidden laws accessible to those with the proper insight. This belief was not unique to any one culture. In ancient China, Taoist alchemists sought the elixir of immortality, experimenting with minerals, herbs, and strange compounds, often at great personal risk. Mercury, cinnabar, and other substances were consumed in the hope of transcending the human condition. Though many perished from their mixtures, they laid the groundwork for pharmacological inquiry and medicinal exploration. In the Islamic world, alchemy took on a more rigorous and systematized character. The works of scholars such as Jabir ibn Hayyan, Gibber, attempted to classify substances and reactions with precision, introducing concepts such as distillation, crystallization, and calcination. These methods were not only philosophical but practical, influencing the development of laboratory techniques that would survive for centuries. Geber's texts, while couched in symbolic language, displayed an acute observational discipline. For him, alchemy was not just about gold. It was about uncovering the hidden architecture of the world, an effort that prefigured the scientific method. The translation of Arabic texts into Latin during the European Middle Ages ignited a revival of alchemical thought in the West. Monastic scholars and early natural philosophers eagerly copied and studied these manuscripts, fascinated by their cryptic formulas and tantalizing claims. Figures such as Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon were instrumental in integrating alchemical principles with Christian cosmology. Alchemy became a way to understand divine creation, as well as a means of enhancing material knowledge. Laboratories appeared in abbeys and universities where substances were heated, cooled, and observed for their properties. Though wrapped in esoteric symbols and veiled language, the process of experimentation and replication was taking root. One of the most influential Western alchemists, Paracelsus, challenged conventional medical doctrines by arguing that alchemy should serve the healing arts. For him, the transmutation of metals was secondary to the transformation of the body. He introduced the idea of chemical medicine, using compounds like mercury and sulfur to treat illnesses. While his methods were often controversial and his theories difficult to parse, Paracelsus advanced a vision of alchemy grounded in practical application, not just spiritual metaphor. His insistence that the body functioned according to chemical principles was a radical break from humoral theory and an early step toward biochemistry. In many ways, alchemy represented the convergence of various streams of ancient knowledge: mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, philosophy, and religion, all funneled into a single pursuit. It was not an exact science, nor did it aim to be. Rather, it was a discipline of observation, intuition, and synthesis. Practitioners read the stars and studied the seasons, tracked the color changes of heated ores, and tested their theories against both the natural world and sacred texts. Alchemy was a system of symbols and metaphors, but it also required direct engagement with materials. Furnaces, alembics, and crucibles were essential tools, and the layout of the alchemist's workshop bore a striking resemblance to modern chemical laboratories. The appeal of alchemy endured not only because of its promises, but also because it captured the imagination. It suggested that matter itself had a hidden soul, a potential for perfection waiting to be unlocked. The quest for the philosopher's stone, the mythical substance said to transmute base metals and grant eternal life, was less about material wealth than it was about completeness. To possess the stone was to achieve harmony with the cosmos, to bridge the gap between the physical and the metaphysical. This aspiration reflected the ancient worldview, one in which the human being was seen as a microcosm of the universe. capable of great internal and external transformation. Even as empirical science began to emerge in the Renaissance and Enlightenment, it carried with it echoes of alchemical thought. Isaac Newton, whose laws of motion and gravity revolutionized physics, was himself a dedicated alchemist. His private writings reveal a deep interest in the transmutation of metals and the hidden properties of substances. Far from being a contradiction, Newton's dual engagement with alchemy and mathematics demonstrates how intertwined the mystical and rational once were. To seek hidden laws, to believe that nature held secrets accessible through perseverance and purity of thought, was part of the same intellectual tradition. The contributions of alchemy to innovation were significant, even if indirect. The repeated distillation of substances led to advancements in alcohol production, perfume making, and the refining of oils. Alchemists' experiments with acids and salts contributed to the development of chemistry. Their focus on precision, temperature control, and measurement laid the foundation for scientific procedures. What began as a mystical pursuit eventually gave rise to reproducible techniques and verifiable results. Alchemy's long shadow stretches across the scientific revolution, reminding us that the roots of progress are often tangled in the myths of the past. Across cultures, alchemy also became a vehicle for artistic and literary expression. The symbolic imagery used by alchemists, dragons, lions, birds, and serpents, represented various substances and stages of transformation. These symbols were not merely decorative, they communicated complex processes and philosophies in a language that transcended literacy. Artists and poets, inspired by these symbols, wove them into their works, enriching the cultural legacy of alchemy far beyond the laboratory. Even architecture reflected alchemical principles, with certain buildings designed according to numerological or cosmological correspondences thought to enhance spiritual or material transformation. What is remarkable about ancient alchemy is its universality. Despite vast differences in language, religion, and geography, similar themes appear across the alchemical traditions of Egypt, India, China, Persia, and Europe. This convergence suggests a shared human fascination with transformation and mastery over nature. In every culture, alchemy promised more than technical knowledge. It offered a narrative of hope, an idea that through effort and insight, one could ascend beyond limitation. This spiritual dimension was never separate from the physical. To transmute a substance was also to transmute the self. The furnace purified not only metals, but also minds. The eventual decline of alchemy as a mainstream discipline did not erase its legacy. Instead, it was absorbed and refined by emerging sciences. Chemistry, pharmacology, and metallurgy carried forward many of its techniques, stripped of esoteric language but enriched by centuries of experimentation. The dream of transformation persisted, though now framed in the language of atoms and molecules rather than spirits and essences. The spirit of inquiry, so central to the alchemical tradition, continued to animate scientific discovery. Even today, researchers seeking to manipulate matter at the quantum or molecular level carry forward the alchemical desire to unlock the hidden structure of the universe. In reflecting on alchemy, it is essential to recognize the sincerity of its practitioners. They were not charlatans or mere dreamers, but thinkers who operated within the intellectual boundaries of their time. Their willingness to combine observation with imagination, theory with practice, marks them as forerunners of modern science. They believed that truth was not found in separation but in synthesis, that understanding required both the fire of the furnace and the fire of the mind. In their crucibles, they sought not only gold but wisdom, and in doing so, they lit the first sparks of a tradition that would grow into the brilliant blaze of scientific discovery.